Chapter 22 of the Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1, by Eugène Sue, History of David and Cecily. Mr. Willis, a rich American planter, settled in Florida, said Murphy, had discovered in one of his young black slaves, named David, who was employed in the infirmary attached to his dwelling, a very remarkable degree of intelligence, combined with a constant and deep commiseration for the sick poor, to whom he gave with the utmost attention and care the medicine ordered by the doctors, and moreover so strong a prepossession for the study of botany, as applied to medicine, that without any tuition he had composed and classified a sort of flora of the plants around the dwelling and the vicinity. The establishment of Mr. Willis, situated on the borders of the sea, was 15 or 20 leagues from the nearest town, and the medical men of the district, ignorant as they were, gave themselves no great deal of care or trouble, in consequence of the long distance and the difficulty in procuring any means of conveyance. Desirous of remedying so extreme an inconvenience in a country subject to violent epidemics, and to have at hand at all times a skilful practitioner, the colonist made up his mind to send David to France to learn surgery and medicine. Enchanted at this offer, the young black set out for Paris, and the planter paid all the expenses of his course of study. David, having for 8 years studied with great diligence and remarkable effect, received the degree of surgeon and physician with the most distinguished success, and then returned to America, to place himself and his skill under the direction of his master. But David ought to have considered himself free and emancipated, in fact and in law, when he set foot in France. David's loyalty is very rare. He had promised Mr. Willis to return, and he did so. He did not consider at his own the instruction which he had acquired with his master's money, and besides he hoped to improve morally as well as physically the sufferings of the slaves, his former companions. He trusted to become not only their doctor, but their firm friend and defender with the colonist. He must indeed be imbued with the most unflinching probity and the most intense love for his fellow creatures to return to a master, an owner, after having spent 8 years in the midst of the society of the most democratic young men in Europe. Judge of the man by this one trait. While he returned to Florida, and truth to tell, was used by Mr. Willis with consideration and kindness, eating at his table, sleeping under his roof. But this colonist was as stupid, malevolent, selfish and despotic as most Creoles are, and he thought himself very generous in giving David 600 francs a year salary. At the end of some months, a terrible typhus fever broke out in the plantation. Mr. Willis was attacked by it, but soon restored through the careful attentions and efficacious remedies of David. Out of 30 negroes dangerously affected by this fatal disease, only 2 perished. Mr. Willis, much gratified by the services which David had so auspiciously rendered, raised his wages to 1200 francs, to the extreme gratification of the black doctor, whose fellows regarded him as a divinity amongst them, for he had, with much difficulty it is true, obtained from their master some few indulgences, and was hoping to procure still more. In the meanwhile, he consoled these poor people, and exhorted them to patience. Speak to them of God, who watches over the black and the white man with an equal eye, of another world not peopled with masters and slaves, but with the just and the unjust, of another life in eternity, where man was no longer the beast of burden, the property, the thing of his fellow man, but where the victims of this world were so happy that they prayed in heaven for their tormentors. What shall I tell you more to those unhappy wretches who, contrary to other men, count with bitter joy the hours which bring them nearer to the tomb, to those unfortunate creatures who looked forward only to nothingness hereafter? David breathed the language and the hope of a free and happy immortality, and their chains appeared less heavy and their toil less irksome. He was their idol. A year passed away in this manner. Amongst the handsomest of the female slaves at the house was a métisse about 15 years of age, named Cecily, and for this poor girl Mr. Willis took a fancy. For the first time in his life his advances were repulsed and obstinately resisted. Cecily was in love, and with David, who during the late fearful distemper had attended her with the most vigilant care. Afterwards, a deep and mutual love repaid him the debt of gratitude. David's taste was too refined to allow him to boast of his happiness before the time when he should marry Cecily, which was to be when she had turned her 16th year. Mr. Willis, ignorant of their love, had thrown his handkerchief right royally at the pretty métisse, and she, in deep despair, sought David, and told him all the brutal attempts that she had been subjected to, and with difficulty escaped. The black confronted her, and instantly went to Mr. Willis to request her hand in marriage. Diable, my dear Murphy, I can easily surmise the answer of the American Sultan. He refused? He did. He said he had an inclination for the girl himself, that in his life before he had never experienced the repulse of a slave. He meant to possess her, and he would. David might choose another wife or mistress, whichsoever might best suit his inclination. There were in the plantation 10 capus or métisses as pretty as Cecily. David talked of his love so long and tenderly shared, and the planter shrugged his shoulders. David urged, but it was all in vain. The Creole had the cool impudence to tell him that it was a bad example to see a master concede to a slave, and that he would not set that example to satisfy a caprice of David's. He entreated, supplicated, and his master lost his temper. David, blushing to humiliate himself further, spake in a firm tone of his services and disinterestedness, that he had been contented with a very slender salary. Mr. Willis was desperately enraged, and telling him he was a contumacious slave, threatened him with the chain. David replied with a few bitter and violent words, and 2 hours afterwards, bound to a stake, his skin was torn with the lash, whilst they bore Cecily to the harem of the planter in his sight. The conduct of the planter was brutal and horrible. It was add an absurdity to cruelty, for he must after that have required the man's services. Precisely so, for that very day the very fury into which he had worked himself, joined to the drunkenness in which the brute indulged every evening, brought on an inflammatory attack of the most dangerous description, the symptoms of which appeared with rapidity peculiar to such affections. The planter was carried to his bed in a state of the highest fever. He sent off an express for a doctor, but he could not reach his abode in less than 36 hours. Really, this attack seems providential. The desperate condition of the man was quite deserved by him. The malady made fearful strides. David only could save the colonist, but Willis, distrustful as all evildoers are, imagined that the black would revenge himself by administering poison, for after having scourged him with a rod, he had thrown him into prison. At last, horrified at the progress of his illness, broken down by bodily anguish, and thinking that as death also stared him in the face, he had one chance left in trusting to the generosity of his slave. After many distrusting doubts, Willis ordered David to be enchained, and David saved the planter. For 5 days and 5 nights he watched and tended him as if he had been his father, counteracting the disease step by step with great skill and perfect knowledge, until at last he succeeded in defeating it, to the extreme surprise of the doctor who had been sent for, and who did not arrive until the 2nd day. And when restored to health at last, the colonist, not desiring to blush before his own slave, whose presence constantly oppressed him with the recollection of his excessive nobleness of conduct, the colonist made an enormous sacrifice to attach the daughter he had sent for to his establishment, and David was again conducted to his dungeon. Horrible, but by no means astonishing. David must have been in the eyes of his brutal master a complete living remorse. Such conduct was dictated alike by revenge and jealousy. The blacks of Mr. Willis loved David with all the warmth of gratitude, for he had saved them body and soul. They knew the care he had bestowed on him when he lay tossed with fever between life and death, and shaken off the deadening apathy which ordinarily besets slavery. These unfortunate creatures evinced their indignation, or rather grief, most powerfully when they saw David lacerated by the whip. Mr. Willis, deeply exasperated, affected to discover in this manifestation the appearance of revolt, and when he considered the influence which David had acquired over the slaves, he believed him capable of placing himself at the head of a rebellion to avenge himself of his wrongs. This fear was another motive with the colonist for using David in the most shameful manner, and entirely preventing him from effecting the malicious designs of which he suspected him. Considering him as actuated by an irrepressible amount of terror, this conduct seems less stupid but quite as ferocious. A short time after these events, we arrived in America. Monseigneur had frightened a Danish brig at St. Thomas's, and we visited incognito all the settlements of the American coast along which we were sailing. We were most hospitably received by Mr. Willis, who the evening after our arrival, after he had been drinking, and as much from the excitement of wine as from a desire to boast, told us in a horrid tone of brutal jesting the history of David and Cecily. I forgot to say that after having maltreated the girl, he had thrown her into a dungeon also, as a punishment for her disdain of him. His Royal Highness, on hearing Willis's fearful narration, thought the man was either drunk or a liar, but he was drunk. It was no lie. To remove any and all doubt, the colonist rose from the table and desired a slave to bear a lantern and conduct us to David's cell. Well, what followed? In my life I never saw so distressing a spectacle. Pale, wan, meagre, half-naked, and covered with wounds, David and the unhappy girl chained by the middle of the body, one at one end and the other at the other end of the dungeon, looked like spectres. The lantern that lighted us threw over the scene a still more ghastly hue. David did not utter a word when he saw us. His gaze was fixed and fearful. The colonist said to him with cruel irony, "Well, doctor, how goes it? You who are so clever, why don't you show yourself?" The black replied by a noble word and a dignified gesture. He raised his right hand slowly, his forefinger pointed to the roof, and without looking at the colonist said in a solemn tone, "God," and then was silent. "God," replied the planter, bursting into a loud fit of laughter. "Tell him then, tell God to come and snatch you from my power. I defy him." Then Willis, overcome by fury and intoxication, shook his fist to heaven and said in blasphemous language, "Yes, I defy God to carry off my slaves before they are dead." The man was mad as well as brutal. We were utterly disgusted. Monseigneur did not say a word, and we left the cell. This dungeon was situated, as well as the house, on the seashore. We returned to our brig, which was moored a short distance off, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, when all in the building were plunged in profound sleep, Monseigneur went on shore with 8 men well armed, and going straight to the prison, burst open the doors and freed David and Cecily. The 2 victims were carried on board so quietly that they were not perceived, and then Monseigneur and I went to the planter's house. Strange contrast! These men torture their slaves, and yet do not take any precaution against them, but sleep with doors and windows open. We easily got access to the sleeping room of the planter, which was lighted on the inside by a small glass lamp. Monseigneur awakened the man, who sat upright in his bed, his brain still disturbed by the effect of his drunkenness. "You have tonight defied God to carry off your 2 victims before their death, and he has taken them," said Monseigneur. Then, taking a bag which I carried, and which contained 25,000 francs in gold, he threw it on the fellow's bed, and added, This will indemnify you for the loss of your 2 slaves. To your violence that destroys, I oppose a violence that saves. God will judge between us." We then retreated, leaving Mr. Willis stupefied, motionless, and believing himself under the influence of a dream. A few minutes later we were again on board the brig, which instantly set sail. It appears to me, my dear Murphy, that His Royal Highness overpaid the wretch for the loss of his slaves, for in fact David no longer belonged to him. We calculated as nearly as we could the expense which his studies had cost for 8 years, and then the price thrice over of himself and Cecily as slaves. Our conduct was contrary to the rights of property, I know, but if you had seen in what a horrible state we found this unfortunate and half-dead couple, if you had heard the sacrilegious defiance almost cast in the face of the Almighty by this man, drunk with wine and ferocity, you would comprehend how Monseigneur desired, as he said, on this occasion to act as it were in behalf of Providence. All this is as assailable and as justifiable as the punishment of the schoolmaster, my worthy squire. And had not this adventure any consequences? It could not. The brig was under Danish colours. The incognito of His Royal Highness was closely kept. We were taken for rich Englishmen. To whom could Willis have addressed his complaints if he had any to make? In fact, he had told us himself, and the medical man of Monseigneur declared it in a procès-verbal, that the 2 slaves could not have lived 8 days longer in this frightful dungeon. It required the greatest possible care to snatch David and Cecily from almost certain death. At last they were restored to life. From this period David has been attached to the suite of Monseigneur as a medical man, and is most devotedly attached to him. David married Cecily, of course, on arrival in Europe. This marriage, which ought to have been followed by results so happy, took place in the chapel of the palace of Monseigneur, but by a most extraordinary revulsion of conduct. Hardly was she in the full enjoyment of an unhoped-for position, when forgetting all that David had suffered for her and what she had suffered for him, blushing in the new world to be wedded to a black, Cecily, seduced by a man of most depraved morals, committed her first fault. It would seem as though the natural perversity of this abandoned woman, having till then slumbered, was suddenly awakened and developed itself with fearful energy. You know the rest and all the scandal of the adventures that followed. After having been 2 years a wife, David, whose confidence in her was only equalled by his love, learned the full extent of her infamy. A thunderbolt roused him from his blind security. They say he tried to kill his wife. Yes, but through the interference of Monseigneur, he consented to allow her to be immured for life in a prison, and it is thence that Monseigneur now seeks to have her released, to your great astonishment as well as mine, my dear Baron. But it is growing late, and His Royal Highness is anxious that your courier should start for Gérolstein with as little delay as possible. In 2 hours' time he shall be on the road. So now, my dear Murphy, farewell till the evening. Till the evening, adieu. Have you then forgotten that there is a grand ball at the embassy, and that His Royal Highness will be present? True, I have always forgotten that, since the absence of Colonel Vernet and the Count d'Arnay, I have the honor to fulfill the functions of Chamberlain and aide-de-camp. Ah, apropos of the Count and the Colonel, when may we expect their return? Will they have soon completed their respective missions? You know that Monseigneur will keep them away as long as possible, that he may enjoy more solitude and liberty. As to the errand of which His Royal Highness has employed each of them, as an ostensible motive for getting rid of them in a quiet way, sending one to Avignon and the other to Strasbourg, I will tell you all about it some day, when we are both in a dull mood, for I will defy the most hypochondriacal person in existence not to burst with laughter at the narrative as well as with certain passages in the dispatches of these worthy gentlemen. who have assumed their pretended missions with so serious an air. To tell the truth, I have never clearly understood why His Royal Highness attached the Colonel and the Count to his private person. Why, my dear fellow, is not Colonel Vernet the accurate type of military perfection? Is there in the whole Germanic Confederation a more elegant figure, more flourishing and splendid moustache, and a more complete military figure? And when he is fully decorated, screwed in, uniformed, gold-laced, plumed, etc., etc., it is impossible to see a more glorious, self-satisfied, proud, handsome animal. True, but it is his very good looks that prevent him from having the appearance of a man of refined and acute intellect. Well, and Monseigneur says that, thanks to the Colonel, he is in the habit of finding even the dullest people in the world bearable. Before certain audiences, which are of necessity, he shuts himself up with the Colonel for a half-hour or so, and then leaves him full of spirits and light as air, quite ready to meet boars and defy them. Just as the Roman soldier who, before a forced march, used to sole his sandals with lead, and so found all fatigue light by leaving them off, I now discover the usefulness of the Colonel. But the Count d'Arnhem is also very serviceable to our dear Lord, for always hearing at his side the tinkling of his old cracked bell, shining and chattering, continually seeing this soap bubble so puffed up with nothingness, so magnificently variegated, and as such portraying the theatrical and puerile face of sovereign power. His Royal Highness feels the more sensibly the vanity of those barren pomps and glories of the world, and by contrast has often derived the most serious and happy ideas from the contemplation of his useless and pattering chamberlain. Well, well, but let us be just, my dear Murphy. Tell me in what court in the world would you find a more perfect model of a chamberlain, who knows better than dear old Darnay the numberless rules and strict observances of etiquette, who bears with more becoming demeanour an enamelled cross round his neck, or more majestically comports himself when the keys of office are suspended from his shoulders. Apropos, Baron, Monseigneur declares that the shoulders of a chamberlain have a peculiar physiognomy. That is, he says, an appearance at once constrained and repulsive, which it is painful to look at, for alas and alackaday, it is at the back of a chamberlain that the symbol of his office glitters, and as Monseigneur avers, the worthy Darnay always seemed tempted to present himself backwards, that his importance might at once be seen, felt, and acknowledged. The fact is, that the incessant subject of the Count's meditations is to ascertain by what fatal imagination and direction the chamberlain's key has been placed behind the chamberlain's back. For it is related of him that he said, with his accustomed good sense, and with a kind of bitter grief, "What the devil! One does not open a door with one's back, at all events." "Baron, the courier," said Murphy, pointing to the clock. "Sad old reprobate, to make me chatter thus. It is your fault. Present my respects to his Royal Highness," said Monsieur de Graün, taking his hat up in haste. "And now adieu till the evening, my dear Murphy." "Till the evening, my dear Baron. Fare thee well. It will be late before we meet, for I am sure that Monseigneur will go this very day to pay a visit to the mysterious house in the Rue du Temple." End of chapter 22.
Part 1 of Chapter 23 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue, Volume 1. Chapter 23. A House in the Rue du Temple, Part 1. In order to profit by the particulars furnished by the Baron de Graün respecting La Goualeuse and Germain, the schoolmaster's son, it became necessary for Rodolphe to visit the house in the Rue du Temple, formerly the abode of that young man, whose retreat the prince likewise hoped to discover through the intervention of Mademoiselle Rigolette. Although prepared to find it a difficult task, inasmuch as it was probable, if the grisette were really sufficiently in Germain's confidence to be aware of his present abode, she also knew too well his anxiety to conceal it, to be likely to give the desired information. By renting the chamber lately occupied by the young man, Rodolphe, besides being on the spot to follow up his researches, considered he should also be enabled to observe closely the different individuals inhabiting the rest of the house. The same day on which the conversation passed between the Baron de Graün and Murphy, Rodolphe, plainly and unpretendingly dressed, wended his way about 3 o'clock on a gloomy November afternoon towards the Rue du Temple. Situated in a district of much business and dense population, the house in question had nothing remarkable in its appearance. It was composed of a ground floor, occupied by a man keeping a low sort of dram shop, and 4 upper stories surmounted by attics. A dark and narrow alley led to a small yard, or rather a species of square well, of about 5 or 6 feet in width, completely destitute of either air or light, and serving as a pestilential receptacle for all the filth thrown by the various occupants of the respective chambers from the unglazed sashes with which each landing-place was provided. At the bottom of a damp, dismal-looking staircase, a glimmering light indicated the porter's residence, rendered smoky and dingy by the constant burning of a lamp, requisite even at midday to enlighten the gloomy hole into which Rodolphe entered for the purpose of asking leave to view the apartment then vacant. A lamp placed behind a glass globe filled with water served as a reflector, and by its light might be seen at the far end of the lodge, as in courtesy it was styled, a bed covered with a sort of patchwork counterpane, exhibiting a mingled mass of every known colour and material. A walnut-tree table graced the side of the room, bearing a variety of articles suited to the taste and ornamental notions of its owners. First in order appeared a little waxen St. John, with a very fat lamb at his feet, and a large peruke of flowing white curls on his head, the whole enclosed in a cracked glass case, the joinings of which were ingeniously secured by slips of blue paper. Secondly, a pair of old plated candlesticks, tarnished by time, and bearing, instead of lights, 2 gilded oranges, doubtless an offering to the portress on the last New Year's Day. And thirdly, 2 boxes, the one composed of variegated straw, the other covered with multitudinous shells, but both smelling strongly of the galleys or house of correction. Note, these boxes were the exclusive manufacture of the criminals confined either in the galleys or prisons, and who spent nearly all their spare hours in making them. End of note. Let us hope, for the sake of the morality of the porteress in the Rue du Temple, that these precious specimens were not presented to her from the original owners and fabricators of them. And lastly, between the 2 boxes, and just beneath a circular clock, was suspended a pair of red morocco dress boots, small enough for the feet of fairies, but elaborately and skilfully designed and completed. This chef d'oeuvre, as the ancient masters of the craft would style them, joined to the fantastic designs sketched on the walls, representing boots and shoes, abundantly indicated that the porter of this establishment devoted his time and his talents to the repairing of shoes and shoe leather. At the instant when Rodolphe ventured into the smoky den, M. Pipelet, the porter, temporarily absent, had left his better half, Madame Pipelet, as his representative. This individual was seated by the stove in the centre of the lodge, deeply engaged in watching the boiling of a pot placed over it. The description of Madame Pipelet may be given in a few words. She was the most ugly, forbidding, wrinkled, toothless old hag one might meet in the course of a long life. Her dress was dirty, tawdry, and untidy, while her headdress was composed of a Brutus wig, originally of a blonde colour, but changed by time into every shade of red, brown, and yellow, the stiff ends of this perished hair standing out like the ears of wheat in a wheat sheaf. Much did Madame Pipelet pride herself upon this tasteful covering to her sexagenarian skull. nor was it believed she ever laid it aside, whether sleeping or waking. At the sight of Rodolphe, the portress inquired in a surly tone, "Well, and pray what do you want?" "I believe, madame," replied Rodolphe, laying a profound emphasis on the word madame, "I believe there is an apartment to be let in this house." The deep respect implied in his voice and words somewhat mollified the portress, who answered, rather less sourly, "Yes, there is a room to let on the 4th floor, but you cannot see it now. Alfred has gone out." "You are speaking of your son, I presume, madame. May I take the liberty of asking whether he is expected in shortly?" "I am not speaking of my son, but my husband. I suppose there is no Act of Parliament why my Pipelet should not be called Alfred, is there, pray?" "None, certainly, madame, that I am aware of; but with your kind permission I will await his return. I am very desirous of taking the vacant chamber. Both the street and neighbourhood suit me, and the admirable order in which the house seems kept pleases me excessively. But, previously to viewing the lodging I am anxious to take, I should be very glad to ascertain whether you, madame, could do me the favour to take the management of my little housekeeping off my hands. I never like to have any one about me but the authorised housekeeper belonging to the house, when such arrangements meet with their approbation." This proposition, so flatteringly expressed, and the word housekeeper, completely won Madame Pipelet, who replied, "With the greatest of pleasure, sir. I will attend to all you require. I am sure I shall be proud to wait on such a gentleman, and for the small charge of 6 francs a month you shall be treated like a prince." "Then for 6 francs a month I may reckon upon your valuable services. Will you permit me to ask your name?" "Pomona Fortunata Anastasia Pipelet." "Well, then, Madame Pipelet, having agreed as to your own terms, will you be pleased to tell me those for the apartment I wish to engage?" "With the adjoining small closet, 150 francs a month, not a farthing less. The principal lessee is a screw, a regular skinflint." "What is his name?" "Monsieur Bras Rouge." This name, and the remembrances so unexpectedly presented by it, made Rodolphe start. "I think, Madame Pipelet, you were saying that the principal lessee of the house is—" "Monsieur Bras Rouge." "And he lives—"
"Rue aux Fers, No. 13. He also keeps an estaminet near the Champs Elysées."
All doubt was then at an end. It was the Bras Rouge of infamous notoriety, and singular indeed did the circumstance of thus coming across him strike Rodolphe. "But though M. Bras Rouge is your principal lessee, he is not, I presume, the owner of the house. May I ask who he is?"
"M. Bourdon, but I have never had communication with any one besides M. Bras Rouge."
With the design of still further ingratiating himself with the portress, Rodolphe resumed, "My dear madame, this cold day would make a little of something warm and comfortable very acceptable. Might I venture to solicit the favour of your stepping as far as the spirit shop, kept so conveniently at hand, and bring a bottle of cassia and 2 glasses? For I feel very tired, and the cold has quite seized me. Stay, madame, we will have 3 glasses, if you please, because I hope your husband will join us when he returns." So saying, he placed a franc in the fat, dirty hand of the porteress.
"Ah, monsieur, you are determined to make us all fall in love with you,"
cried Madame Pipelet, nodding her approval of the commission, and thereby sending the flush of pleasure into a face glowing with all the fiery honours of an excited bacchante.
"To be sure, there's nothing like a drop of really good cordial on such a day as this, and they do keep most excellent here at hand. I'll go, of course I will, but I shall only bring a couple of glasses, for Alfred and I always drink out of the same glass. Poor old darling, he's so very nice, and particular in showing all those sorts of delicate attentions to women."
"Then go along, my good Madame Pipelet, and we will wait till Alfred comes."
"But then, suppose any one wants me while I am out, who will mind the lodge?"
"Oh, I'll take care of the lodge." The old woman departed on her agreeable errand. At the termination of a few minutes, the postman tapped on the lodge window, and, putting his hand into the apartment, presented 2 letters, merely saying, "3 sous." "6 sous, you mean, for 2 letters," replied Rodolphe. "One is free," answered the man. Having paid and dismissed the postman, Rodolphe mechanically examined the 2 letters thus committed to his charge, but at a further glance they seemed to him worthy of a more attentive observation. The epistle addressed to Madame Pipelet exhaled through its hot-pressed envelope a strong odour of Russia leather. It bore, on a seal of wax, the initials C.R., surmounted by a helmet, and supported by a cross of the Legion of Honour. The direction was written in a firm, bold hand. The heraldic device of the commingled casque and cross made Rodolphe smile, and confirmed him in the idea that the writer of the letter in question was not a female. Who was this scented, emblazoned correspondent of old Anastasia Pipelet? Rodolphe felt an undefinable curiosity to know. The other epistle, written upon coarse and common paper, was united only by a common wafer, pricked over with the point of a pin, and was addressed to Monsieur César Bradamanti, operating dentist. Evidently disguised, the superscription was entirely composed of capital letters. Whether founded on a true or false presage, this letter seemed to Rodolphe to wear a mournful look, as though evil or misery were contained within its shabby folds. He perceived that some of the letters in the direction were fainter than the others, and that the paper there seemed a little rumpled. A tear had evidently fallen upon it. Madame Pipelet returned, bearing the bottle of cassia and 2 glasses. "I have dawdled, have I not, monsieur?" said she, gaily. "But let you once get into that good Père Joliffe's shop, and it is hard work to get out again. Oh, that old man is a very insinuating—" "Here, madame," interrupted Rodolphe. "Here are 2 letters the postman left while you were gone." "Dear me, 2 letters! Pray excuse me, monsieur. I suppose you paid for them?" "I did." "You are very good. I tell you what, then, we will settle that out of the first money you have to pay me. How much was it?" 3 sous, answered Rodolphe, much amused at the ingenious method of reimbursement employed by Madame Pipelet. "But may I, without offence, observe that one of the letters is addressed to you, and that you possess in the writer a correspondent whose billets doux are marvellously well perfumed?" "Let us see what it is about," said the porteress, taking the epistle in the scented envelope. "Yes, upon my word, it is scented like a real billet doux. Oh, now, I should very much like to know who would dare write me a love letter. He must be a villain. And suppose it had fallen into your husband's hands, Madame Pipelet? Oh, for goodness sake, don't mention that, or I shall faint away in your arms. Oh, but how stupid I am! Now I know all about it," replied the fat porteress, shrugging her shoulders. To be sure, it comes from the commandant. Oh, bless me, what a fright I have had, for Alfred is as jealous as a Turk. Here is another letter addressed to Monsieur César Bradamanti. To be sure, the dentist on the 3rd floor. I will put it in the letter boot." Rodolphe fancied he had not caught the right words, but, to his astonishment, he saw Madame Pipelet gravely throw the letter alluded to into an old top boot hanging up against the wall. He looked at her with surprise. "Do you mean," said he at length, "to put the gentleman's letter in—" "Oh, yes, that is all right," replied the porteress. "I have put it in the letter boot. There, you see, so now nobody's letters can be mislaid, and when the different lodgers return home, Alfred or myself turns the boot upside down, we sort them out, and everybody gets his own." So saying, the porteress proceeded to break the seal of the letter addressed to her, which, having done, she turned it round and round, looked at it in every direction, and then, after a short appearance of embarrassment and uncertainty, she said to Rodolphe, "Alfred generally reads my letters for me, because I do not happen to be able to read them myself. Perhaps you would not mind just looking over this for me?" "With the utmost pleasure," quickly replied Rodolphe, curious to dive into the mysteries of who Madame Pipelet's correspondent might be, and forthwith he read what follows, written upon hot-pressed paper, stamped in its right-hand corner with the helmet, the letters C.R., the heraldic supporters, and the cross of honour. "Tomorrow, Friday, about 11 o'clock, let there be a good, not over fierce, fire, lighted in both rooms. Have everything well dusted, and remove the coverings from the furniture, taking especial care not to scratch the gilding, or to soil or burn the carpet while lighting the fires. If I should not be in about 1 o'clock, when a lady will arrive in a hackney coach, and inquire for me by the name of Monsieur Charles, let her be shown up to the apartment. after which the key is to be taken downstairs again and kept till my arrival." Spite of the want of finished composition displayed in this billet, Rodolphe perfectly comprehended to whom and what it alluded, and merely added, after perusing it, "Who lives on the first floor, then?" The old woman placed her yellow shrivelled finger upon her pendulous lip, and replied by a half-malicious grin, "Hush! There is a woman in the way. Silence!" "Oh, my dear Madame Pipelet, I merely asked because, before living in a house, one likes to know a little." Yes, of course everybody likes to know all they can, and that is all fair enough, and I'm sure I have no objection to tell you all I know myself, and that is but very little. Well, to begin, about 6 weeks ago, a carpet-maker came here to look at the first floor, which was then to let, and to ask the price, and other particulars about it. Next day he came again, accompanied by a young man of fair complexion, small moustaches, and wearing a cross of honour and very fine linen. The carpet-maker called him commandant. "A military man, I suppose," said Rodolphe. "Military!" exclaimed Madame Pipelet with a chuckle. "No, not he. Why, Alfred might as well call himself porter to a prince." "How so?" "Why, he's only in the National Guard. The carpet-maker only called him commandant to flatter him, just the same as it tickles up Alfred's vanity to be called concierge instead of porter. So when the commandant, that is the only name we know him by, had looked over the rooms, he said to the upholsterer, his friend, 'Well, I think the place will do for me. Just see the landlord and arrange all about it.' 'Yes, commandant,' says the other. And the very next day the upholsterer man signed the leaf with M. Bras Rouge, in his own name, mind you, and further paid 6 months in advance, because he said the gentleman did not wish to be bored about references, and such a power of fine furniture was sent into the first floor. Sophixus, sarcophagus, curtains, all silk, glasses set in gold, and everything you can measure, all beautiful enough to astonish you, just for all the world like one of them grand cafes on the boulevards. As for the carpets, you never trod on the like of them, I'll be bound. Put your foot on them, and you'd fancy you were stepping on velvet, and take it off again for fear of spoiling it. When everything was completed, the commandant came to look at it, just to see if he could find out anything more he wanted, but he could not. So then he spoke to Alfred, and says he, 'Could you take charge of my rooms and keep them in nice order, light fires from time to time, and get them ready for me when I wish to occupy them? I shall not be here often,' says he, 'and would always write you a line before coming to give you time to prepare them.' 'Yes, commandant, I can,' answers my flatterer of an Alfred. 'And what shall you charge?' 20 francs a month, commandant.' 20 francs!' exclaimed the commandant. 'Why, porter, you're jesting surely.' And hereupon he began baiting Alfred down in the most shabby manner, trying to squeeze poor people like us out of 2 or 3 miserable francs, when he had been squandering thousands in fitting up his grand apartments, which, after all, he did not mean to live in. However, after a deal of battling, we got 12 francs a month out of him, a paltry, pitiful 2-farthing captain. What difference now between you and him?" answered the portress, addressing Rodolphe with an admiring glance. "You don't call yourself fine names and titles, you only look like a plain body. You must be poor, or you would not perch yourself on the 4th floor, and yet you agreed with me for 6 francs without attempting to bait me down." "And when did the commandant pay you his next visit?" "I'll tell you, and good fun it is, too. My gentleman must have been nicely chorused by somebody. 3 times did he write, same as to-day, ordering us to light a fire and have everything ready for the reception of a lady he expected would come. Come! Yes, I dare say. He may expect a long time first, I think." "Nobody came, then?" "Listen. The first time the commandant arrived, strutting and swelling like a turkey cock, humming and singing after his manner all the gay tunes of the day, walking up and down his fine room with his hands stuck in his pockets, and occasionally stopping to arrange his hair before the glass. We were watching him all the time. Well, this went on for 2 or 3 hours, when I suppose he knew it was no use waiting any longer, so he came downstairs very softly, and with a quite different manner to the pride and consequence he'd marched up with.
By way of teasing him, Pipelet and I went out to him and said, "Commandant, there has been no lady whatever to inquire for you." "Very well," exclaimed he, half mad and half ashamed of being laughed at, and buttoning up his coat, he walked off as fast as he could. The next time, before he came himself, a small note was brought here by a man directed to Monsieur Charles. I strongly suspected he was done again, and Pipelet and me were enjoying a hearty good laugh over it when the commandant arrived. "Captain," says I, putting the back of my hand up to my wig by way of military salute, "here is a letter for you, but I'm afraid it contains news of a second countermarch against you." He looked at me, sour as a crab, snatched the letter from my hand, ready to turn scarlet as a boiled lobster, then walked off, pretending to whistle. But he was finally vexed, ready to hang himself. I could see he was, and it was rare nuts to me. "Go and swallow that pill, my 2-farthing captain," says I to myself. "That serves you right for only giving 12 francs a month for minding your apartments." And the third time. The third time I really thought it was all right. The captain arrived more stuck up with pride than ever, his eyes staring with self-satisfied admiration at himself and the certainty of not being disappointed this time. And let me tell the truth about him. He really is a good-looking man, and dresses well, though he stinks of musk like a civet cat. Well, there was my gentleman arrayed in all his finery, and scarcely condescending to look at us poor folks. He seemed as though he conferred a favour on the earth by deigning to walk on it, and went sticking his nose into the air as if he meant to touch the clouds with it. He took the key, and said to us as he passed upstairs in a jeering, self-complacent tone, as though to revenge himself for having been laughed at twice before, "You will direct the lady to my apartments when she comes." Well, Pipelet and I were so anxious to see the lady he expected, that we did not much reckon upon her keeping her appointment, even if she ever made one. But we went and hid ourselves behind the little door that belongs to the alley, and behold, in a short time, a blue hackney coach with its blinds drawn down stopped at the entrance to the house. "There she is," says I to Alfred. "There's his madame. Let's keep back a bit, for fear we frighten her away." The coachman got off his box and opened the door. Then we saw a female closely covered with a black veil and carrying a muff. She'd evidently been crying, because she kept her handkerchief to her face, for when the steps were let down, instead of alighting, she said some few words to the driver, who, much surprised, shut the door up again.
Then the lady did not get out?
No, she threw herself back in the coach and pressed her handkerchief tightly to her eyes. I rushed out, and before the coachman had time to get on his seat again, I called out, "Hello there, coachee, are you going back again?" "Yes," says he. "Where?" says I. "Where I come from," answers he. "And where did you come from?" asks I again. "From the Rue Saint-Dominique, corner of the Rue Bellechasse."
End of part 1 of chapter 23. Part 2 of chapter 23 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue, Volume 1. Chapter 23. A House in the Rue du Temple, Part 2. Rodolphe started at these words. His dearest friend, the Marquis d'Harville, who, as elsewhere stated, had been for some time labouring under a deep melancholy none could penetrate, lived in the very place just mentioned by Madame Pipelet. Could this mysterious female in the blue fiacre be the Marquise d'Harville? And was it from the lightness and frivolity of her conduct that the mind of her excellent husband was bowed down by doubts and misgivings? These painful suggestions crowded on Rodolphe's mind; but although well acquainted with all the various guests received by the Marquise, he could recollect no one answering the description of the commandant, added to which, any female might have taken a hackney coach from that spot without necessarily living in the street. There was really nothing to identify the unknown of the blue fiacre with Madame d'Harville, and yet 1,000 vague fears and painful suspicions crossed his mind. His uneasy manner and deep abstraction did not escape the porteress.
"What are you thinking of, sir?"
asked she at length. "I was wondering what could have induced the lady, after coming to the very door, to change her mind so suddenly."
"Oh, there's no saying. Some sudden thought, dread, or fear, for we poor women are but weak, cowardly things,"
said the porteress, assuming a timid, frightened manner.
"Well, I think if it had been myself now, coming secretly to visit Alfred, I should have had to try back a great many times before I could have screwed up my courage to venture in. But then, as for visiting your great dons in this kind of way, I never could have done such a thing. No, never. I'm sure there's nobody under the face of heaven can say I ever give them the least freedom. I should think not, indeed, while my poor dear old darling of a husband is left."
No doubt, Madame Pipelet. But about the young person you were describing in the blue fiacre?"
"Oh, mind, I don't know whether she was young or old. I couldn't even catch a glimpse of the tip of her nose. All I can say is, she went as she came, and that is all about it. As for Alfred and me, we were better pleased than if we had found 10 francs.
"Why so?"
"By enjoying the rage and confusion of the commandant when he found himself a third time disappointed. But instead of going and telling him at once that his Madame had been and gone, we allowed him to fume and fret for a whole hour. Then I went softly upstairs with only my list slippers on. I reached his door, which I found half shut. As I pushed against it, it creaked. The staircase is as black as night, and the entrance to the apartment quite as obscure. Scarcely had I crept into the room when the commandant caught me in his arms, saying in a languishing voice, 'My dearest angel, what makes you so late?'"
Spite of the serious nature of thoughts crowding upon his mind, Rodolphe could not restrain a smile as he surveyed the grotesque periwig and hideously wrinkled, carbuncled visage of the heroine of this comic scene. Madame Pipelet, however, resumed her narration with a mirthful chuckle that increased her ugliness.
"Then that was a go, wasn't it? But stop a bit. Well, I did not make the least reply, but almost keeping in my breath, I waited to see what would be the end of this strange reception. For a minute or two the commandant kept hugging me up. Then, all of a sudden, the brute pushed me away, exclaiming with as much disgust as though he had touched a toad, 'Who the devil are you?' 'Me, commandant, the porteress, Madame Pipelet, and as such I will thank you to keep your hands off my waist, and not to call me your angel, and scold me for being late. Suppose Alfred had heard you, a pretty business we should have made of it.' 'What the deuce brings you here?' cried he. 'Merely to let you know the lady in the hackney coach has just arrived.' 'Well, then, you stupid old fool, show her up directly. Did I not tell you to do so?' 'Yes, commandant, you said I was to show her up.' 'Then why do you not obey me?' 'Because the lady—' 'Speak out, woman, if you can.' 'The lady has gone again.' 'Something you have said or done, then, to offend her, I am sure,' roared he, in such a perfect fury. 'Not at all, commandant. The lady did not alight, but when the coach stopped and the driver opened the door, she desired him to take her back to where she came from.' 'The vehicle cannot have gone far by this time,' exclaimed the commandant, hasting towards the door. 'It has been gone upwards of an hour,' answered I, enjoying his fury and disappointment. 'An hour! And what in the devil's name hindered you from letting me know this sooner?' 'Because, commandant, Alfred and I thought we would spare you as long as we could the tidings of this third breakdown, which we fancied might be too much for you. Come, thinks I, there is something to make you remember flinging me out of your arms as though it made you sick to touch me.' 'Begone!' called the commandant. 'You hideous old hag! You can neither say nor do the thing that is right.' And with this he pulled off his dressing gown and threw his beautiful Greek cap, made of velvet embroidered with gold, on the ground. Oh, it was a real shame, for the cap was a downright beauty, and as for the dressing gown, oh my, it would set anybody longing. Meanwhile, the Commandant kept pacing the room, with his eyes glaring like a wild beast and glowing like two glow-worms.
But were you not afraid of losing his employ?
He knew too well what he was about for that. We had him in a fix. We knew where his madame lived, and had he said anything to us, we should have threatened to expose the whole affair. And who do you think, for his beggarly 12 francs, would have undertaken to attend to his rooms? A stranger? No, that we would have prevented. We would soon have made the place too hot for hold any person he might appoint. Poor shabby fellow that he is. What do you think? He actually had the meanness to examine his wood and put out the quantity he should allow to be burnt while he was away. He's nothing but an upstart, I'm sure, a nobody who has suddenly tumbled into money he does not know how to spend properly. A rich man's head and a beggar's body, who squanders with one hand and nips and pinches with the other. I do not wish him any harm, but it amuses me intensely to think how he's been befooled. And he will go on believing and expecting from day to day, because he is too vain to imagine he's being laughed at. At any rate, if the lady ever comes in reality, I will let my friend the oyster woman next door know. She enjoys a joke as well as I do, and is quite as curious as myself to find out what sort of person she is, whether fair or dark, pretty or plain. And who knows? This woman may be cheating some easy-going simpleton of a husband for the sake of our 2 penny halfpenny of a commandant. Well, that's no concern of mine, but I'm sorry too for the poor dear deceived individual, whoever he may be. Oh, dear me, my pot is boiling over. Excuse me a minute, I must just look to it. Oh, it is time Alfred was in, for dinner's quite ready, and tripe, you know, should never be kept waiting. This tripe is done to a turn. Do you prefer the thick or the thin tripe? Alfred likes it thick. The poor darling's been sadly out of spirits lately, and I got this dainty dish to cheer him up a bit, for, as Alfred says himself, that for a bribe of good thick tripe he would betray France itself, his beloved France. Yes, the dear old pet would change his country for such fine fat tripe as this, he would. While Madame Pipelet was thus delivering her domestic harangue upon the virtues of tripe, and the powerful influence it possessed over even the patriotism of her husband, Rodolphe was buried in the deepest and most sombre reflections. The female, whose visit to the house had just been detailed, be she the Marquise d'Harville or any other individual, had evidently long struggled with her imprudence ere she had brought herself to grant a first and second rendezvous. Then, terrified at the probable consequences of her imprudence, a salutary remorse had, in all probability, prevented her from fulfilling her dangerous engagement. It might be that the fine person this M. Charles was described as possessing had captivated the senses of Madame d'Harville, whom Rodolphe knew well as a woman of deep feeling, high intellect, and superior taste, of an elevated turn of mind, and a reputation unsullied by the faintest breath of slander. After long and mature consideration, he succeeded in persuading himself that the wife of his friend had nothing to do with the unknown female in the blue fiacre. Madame Pipelet, having completed her culinary arrangements, resumed her conversation with Rodolphe. "And who lives on the second floor?" inquired he of the portress. "Why, Mother Burette does. A most wonderful woman at fortune-telling. Bless you, she can read in your hand the same as a book, and many quite first-rate people come to her to have the cards consulted when they're anxious about any particular matter. She earns her weight in gold, and that's not a trifle, because she's a rare bundle of an old body. However, telling fortunes is only one of her means of gaining a livelihood."
"Why, what does she do besides?"
"She keeps what you would call a pawnbroker's shop upon a small scale."
"I see. Your second-floor lodger lends out again the money she derives from her skill at foretelling events by reading the cards."
"Exactly so. Only she is cheaper and more easy to deal with than the regular pawnbrokers. She does not confuse you with a heap of paper tickets and duplicates. Nothing of the sort. Now, suppose someone brings Mother Burette a shirt worth 3 francs. Well, she lends 10 sous upon condition of being paid 20 at the end of the week. Otherwise, she keeps the shirt forever. That's simple enough, is it not? Always in round figures, you see. A child could understand it. And the odd things she has brought her as pledges you would scarcely believe. You can hardly guess what she's sometimes asked to lend upon. I saw her once advance money on a grey parrot that swore like a trooper. The blackguard did.
A parrot? But to what amount did she advance money?
I'll tell you. The parrot was well known. It belonged to a Madame Herbelot, the widow of a factor living close by, and it was also well understood that Madame Herbelot valued the parrot as much as she did her life. Well, Mother Burette says to her, I will lend you 10 francs upon your bird, but if by this day week at 12 o'clock I do not receive 20 francs with interest, and it would amount to that in round numbers, if I am not paid my 20 francs with the expense of his keep, I shall give your Polly a trifling dose of arsenic mixed with his food. She knew her customer well, bless you. However, by this threat, Mother Burette received her 20 francs at the end of 7 days, and Madame Herbelot got back her disagreeable screaming parrot.
Mother Burette has no other way of living besides the 2 you have named, I suppose?
Not that I know of. I don't know, however, what to say of some rather sly and secret transactions carried on in a small room she never allows anyone to enter except Monsieur Bras Rouge and an old one-eyed woman called La Chouette.
Rodolphe opened his eyes with unmixed astonishment as these names sounded on his ear, and the portress, interpreting the surprise of her future lodger according to her own notions, said,
That name would make anyone stare with astonishment. Certainly La Chouette is uncommonly odd, is it not?
It is indeed. Does the woman who is so styled come here frequently?
We saw her the day before yesterday for the first time these 6 weeks. She was rather lame, I observed.
And what do you suppose she wants with the fortune-telling woman?
That I do not know. At least, as to what takes place in the little room I was telling you of, where La Chouette alone is admitted with Monsieur Bras Rouge and Mother Burette. I have, however, particularly observed that on those occasions the one-eyed woman always has a large bundle with her in her basket, and that Monsieur Bras Rouge also carries a parcel of some size beneath his cloak, and that they always return empty-handed.
And what can these packets contain?
The Lord above knows, for I don't. Only they kick up the devil's own row with them, whatever they are. And then such whiffs of sulphur, charcoal, and melted lead as you go up the stairs, and blow, blow, blow like a smith's forge. I verily believe Mother Burette has dealings with the old one, and practises magic in this private apartment. Leastways, that is what Monsieur César Bradamanti, our 3rd-floor lodger, said to me. A very clever individual is Monsieur César. When I say individual, I mean an Italian, though he speaks as good French as you or me, excepting his accent, and that is nothing. Oh, he is very clever indeed, knows all about physics, and pulls out teeth, not for the sake of the money, but for the honour of his profession. Yeah, really, sir, for downright honour. Now, suppose you had 6 decayed teeth, and he says the same thing to all who choose to listen to him. Well, then he will take out 5 for nothing, and only charge you for the 6th. Besides which, he sells all manner of remedies for all sorts of complaints. Diseases of the lungs, coughs, cold, every complaint you can name. But then he makes his own drugs, and he has for his assistant the son of our principal lessee, little Tortillard. He says that his master is going to buy himself a horse and a red coat, and to sell his drugs in the market-places, and that young Tortillard is to be dressed like a page and be at the drum to attract customers.
That seems to me a very humble occupation for the son of your principal lessee.
Why, his father says that unless he gets a pretty strong hand over him and a tolerably powerful taste of whipcord in the way of a sound thrashing every now and then, he's safe to come to the scaffold. And he is about the ugliest, most spiteful, ill-disposed young rascal one would wish to meet. He's played more than one abominable trick on poor Monsieur César Bradamanti, though he's the best creature possible. for he cured Alfred of a rheumatic attack, and I promise you we have not forgotten it. Yet there are some people wicked enough to... But no, I will not tell you. It would make the hair of your head stand on end. As Alfred says, if it were true, it would send him to the galleys."
"Why, what do they accuse him of?"
"Oh, I really cannot tell you. I can't. Indeed, for it's so...
"Then we will drop the subject."
And to say such things of a young man! Upon my life and soul, it's too bad."
"Pray, Madame Pipelet, do not give yourself the trouble of saying any more about it. Let us speak of other matters."
"Why, I don't know, but as you are to live in the house, it's only fair and right to prepare you for any falsehoods you may hear. I suppose you're sufficiently well off to make the acquaintance of Monsieur César Bradamanti, and unless you're put on your guard against these reports, they might lead to your breaking off with him. So just put your ear down, and I'll whisper what it is people say about him."
And the old woman, in a low tone, muttered a few words as Rodolphe inclined his head. He started from her with mingled disgust and horror. "Impossible!" exclaimed he. "Surely human nature is not capable of such crimes."
"Shocking, is it not? But treat it as I do. All scandal and lies. What, do you think the man who cured Alfred's rheumatism, who draws 5 teeth out of 6 for nothing, who has testimonials, from every prince and king in the world, and above all pays as he goes, down on the nail, would go to do such things? Not he. I'll stake my blessed life upon it."
While Madame Pipelet thus vented her indignant opinion concerning the reports in circulation, Rodolphe recalled to his memory the letter he had seen addressed to the quack dentist. He remembered the counterfeited writing and the coarse common paper stained with tears, which had well nigh obliterated part of the address. Too well did he see in the mysterious grief-stained epistle the opening of a drama of deep and fearful import. And while these sad presages filled his mind, a powerful impression whispered within him that the dreadful doings ascribed to the Italian were not altogether unfounded.
"Oh, I declare, here comes Alfred!" exclaimed the porteress. "Now, he will tell you his opinion of all these spiteful stories about poor Monsieur Bradamanti. Bless you, Alfred thinks him as innocent as a lamb, ever since he cured his rheumatics."
Monsieur Pipelet entered the lodge with a grave magisterial air. He was about 60 years of age, comfortably fat, with a large broad countenance, strongly resembling, in its cast and style, the faces carved upon the far-famed nutcrackers of Nuremberg, a nose of more than ordinary proportions helping to complete the likeness. An old and dingy-looking hat, with a very deep brim, surmounted the whole. Alfred, who adhered to this upper ornament as tenaciously as his wife did to her Brutus wig, was further attired in an ancient green coat, with immense flaps turned up with grease, if so might be described the bright and shiny patches of long accumulated dirt, which had given an entirely different hue to some portions of the garment. But though clad in the hat and coat esteemed by Pipelet and his wife as closely resembling full dress, Alfred had not laid aside the modest emblem of his trade, but from his waist uprose the buff-coloured triangular front of his leathern apron, partly concealing a waistcoat boasting nearly as great a variety of colours as did the patchwork counterpane of Madame Pipelet. The porter's recognition of Rodolphe as he entered was gracious in the extreme, but alas, he smiled a melancholy welcome, and his countenance and languid air marked a man of secret sorrow.
"Alfred," said Madame Pipelet, when she had introduced her two companions, "here is a gentleman after the apartment on the 4th floor, and we have only been waiting for you to drink a glass of cordial he sent for."
This delicate attention won for Rodolphe the entire trust and confidence of the melancholy porter, who, touching the brim of his hat, said, in a deep bass voice, worthy of being employed in a cathedral,
"We shall give the gentleman every satisfaction as porters, and doubtless he will act the same by us as a lodger. Birds of a feather flock together, as the proverb says."
Then, interrupting himself, Monsieur Pipelet anxiously added,
Providing, sir, you are not a painter." "No, I am not a painter, but a plain merchant's clerk." "Ah, my most humble duty to you, sir. I congratulate you that nature did not make you one of those monsters called artists."
"Artists? Monsters?" returned Rodolphe. "Tell me, pray, why you style them so." Instead of replying, M. Pipelet elevated his clasped hands towards the ceiling, and allowed a heavy sound, between a grunt and a groan, to escape his overcharged breast.
"You must know, sir,"
said Madame Pipelet, in a low tone, to Rodolphe,
"that painters have embittered Alfred's life. I have worried my poor old dear almost out of his senses, and made him half stupefied, as you see him now."
Then, speaking loud, she added, in a caressing tone,
"Oh, never mind the blackguard, there's a dear; but try and forget all about it, or you will be ill, and unable to eat the nice tripe I have got for your dinner."
"Let us hope I shall have courage and firmness enough for all things,"
replied M. Pipelet, with a dignified and resigned air.
"But he has done me much harm. He has been my persecutor, almost my executioner. Long have I suffered, but now I despise him. Ah," said he, turning to Rodolphe, "never allow a painter to enter your doors. They are the plague, the ruin, the destruction of a house."
"You have, then, had a painter lodging with you, I presume?"
"Unhappily, sir, I did have one," replied M. Pipelet, with much bitterness, "and that one named Cabrion. Ah!"
At the recollections brought back by this name, the porter's declaration of courage and endurance utterly failed him, and again his clenched fists were raised, as though to invoke the vengeance he had so lately described himself as despising. "And was this individual the last occupant of the chamber I am about engaging?" inquired Rodolphe.
"No, no. The last lodger was an excellent young man named M. Germain. No, this Cabrion had the room before he came. Ah, sir, since Cabrion left, he has all but driven me stark staring mad."
"And did you, then, so much regret him?" asked Rodolphe.
"Regret him? Regret Cabrion?" screamed the astounded porter. "Why, only imagine, M. Bras Rouge paid him 2 quarters' rent to induce him to quit the place, for unluckily he had taken his apartments for a term. Oh, what a scamp he was! You have no idea of the horrible tricks he played off on all the lodgers as well as us. Why, just to give you one little proof of his villainy, there was hardly a single wind instrument he did not make use of as a sort of annoyance to the lodgers. From the French horn to the flageolet he made use of all, and even carried his rascality so far as to play false, and to keep blowing the same note for hours together. It was enough to worry one out of one's senses. Well, I suppose there were upwards of 20 different petitions sent to our chief lessee, Monsieur Bras Rouge, to turn the beggar out, and at last he was only got rid of by paying him 2 quarters' rent. Rather droll, is it not, for a landlord to pay the lodger? But bless you, the house was so upset by him that he might have had any price so that he would take himself off. However, he did go, and now do you suppose we were clear of Monsieur Cabrion? I'll tell you. Next night, about 11 o'clock, I was in bed, when rap, rap, rap comes to the gate. I pulls up the string. Somebody walks up to my door. "How do you do, porter?" says a voice. "Will you oblige me with a lock of your hair?" "Somebody has mistaken the door," says my wife. So I calls out to the stranger, "You are wrong, friend, you want next door." "I think not," returns the voice. "This is number 17, is it not, and the porter's name is Pipelet? I'm all right, so please to open the door and oblige me with a lock of your beautiful hair. My name is Pipelet, certainly, answers I. Well then, friend Pipelet, Cabrion has sent me for a piece of your hair. He says he must, and he will have it.
As Pipelet uttered the last words, he gave his head a mournful shake, and folding his arms, assumed an attitude of martyr-like resolution.
Do you perceive, sir? He sends to me his mortal enemy, whom he overwhelmed with insults, and continually outraged in every way, to beg a lock of my hair, a favour which even ladies have been known to refuse to a lover.
But suppose this Cabrion had been as good a lodger as was Monsieur Germain, replied Rodolphe, with some difficulty preserving the gravity of countenance. Do you think you might have accorded him the favour?
Not to the best lodger that treads shoe leather would I grant a similar request,
replied the man in the flapped hat, waving it majestically over his brows as he spoke.
It is contrary to my principles and habits to give my hair to any one, only I should have refused with the most scrupulous regard to politeness.
That is not all, chimed in the porteress. Only conceive, sir, the abominable conduct of that Cabrion, who, from morning till night, at all hours and all times, sends a swarm of vagabonds like himself to ask Alfred for a lock of his hair, always for Cabrion.
Oh, monsieur,
sighed out poor Pipelet,
had I committed the most atrocious crimes, my sleep could not have been rendered more broken and unrefreshing. Scarcely do I fall into a doze than I wake, starting with the idea of being called by that cursed Cabrion. Oh, I suspect everybody. In each person who approaches me I see an emissary from my persecutor, come to request a lock of my hair. I am losing my good spirits, my temper, and becoming gloomy, suspicious, peevish, and ill-natured. This infernal Cabrion has murdered my whole life.
And Pipelet heaved so profound a sigh that his hat, vibrating for some time from the consequences of the convulsive shake of the head occasioned thereby, fell forward and completely veiled his care-stricken features. "I can well understand now," said Rodolphe, "that you are not particularly partial to painters. But I suppose the Monsieur Germain you were praising so highly made up for the bad treatment you received from Monsieur Cabrion."
Yes, as I told you, Monsieur Germain was a delightful young man, so honourable and kind-hearted, open as the day, and ever ready to serve and oblige. He was cheerful and merry as need be, but then he always kept his high spirits within proper bounds, instead of worrying people to death with his unmeaning hoaxes, like that Cabrion, who I wish was at the devil.
Come, my good Monsieur Pipelet, I must not let you thus excite yourself. And who now is the person fortunate enough to possess such a pattern of a lodger as this Monsieur Germain seems to have been?
That is more than I can tell you. No one knows whither he has gone, nor are they likely, except, indeed, through Mademoiselle Rigolette.
And who is Mademoiselle Rigolette? demanded Rodolphe.
Why, she is a needlewoman, also living on the 4th floor,
cried Madame Pipelet.
Another pattern lodger always pays her rent in advance, and keeps her little chambers nice and clean. Then she is very well behaved to every one, so merry and happy. Like a bird, though, poor thing, very like a caged bird, obliged to work early and late to earn 2 francs a day, and often not half that, let her try ever so hard.
How does it happen that Mademoiselle Rigolette should be the only person entrusted with the secret of Monsieur Germain's present abode?
Why, when he was going away, he came to us and said, returned Madame Pipelet, I do not expect any letters, but if by chance any should come, please to give them to Mademoiselle Rigolette. And she is well worthy of his confidence, if his letters were filled with gold. Don't you think so, Alfred?
The fact is, said the porter in a severe tone, that I know no harm of Mademoiselle Rigolette, excepting her permitting herself to be wheedled over by that vile scamp Cabrion.
But you know, Alfred, that nothing more than a few harmless attentions passed between them, interrupted the porteress. For though Mademoiselle Rigolette is as merry as a kitten, she is as prudent and correct as I am myself. You should see the strong bolt she has inside her door. And if her next-door neighbour will make love to her, that is not her fault. It follows as a matter of course when people are so close to each other. It was just the same with the travelling clerk we had before Cabrion. And so it was when Monsieur Germain took the room this abominable painter occupied. So, as I say, there is no blame to Mademoiselle Rigolette. It arises out of the two rooms joining one another so closely. Naturally, that brings about a little flirtation, but nothing more."
So then it becomes a matter of course, does it, said Rodolphe, that everyone who occupies the apartment I am to have should make love to Mademoiselle Rigolette?
"Why, of course, monsieur. How can you be good neighbours without it? Don't you see? Now, imagine yourself lodging in the very next room to a nice, pretty, obliging young person like Mademoiselle Rigolette. Well, then, young people will be young people. Sometimes you want a light, sometimes a few live coals to kindle up your fire, maybe a little water, for one is always sure to find plenty of fresh spring water at Mademoiselle Rigolette's. She is never without it. It is her only luxury. She is like a little duck, always dabbling in it. And if she does happen to have a little leisure, such a washing down of floors and cleaning of windows! Never the least soil or neglect about either herself or her apartment, and so you will find."
And so M. Germain, by reason of his close proximity to Mademoiselle Rigolette, became what you style upon perfectly neighbourly terms with her?
"Oh, bless you, yes. Why, the two seemed cut out for each other. So young and so good looking. It was quite a pleasure to look at them as they came downstairs of a Sunday to take the only walk, poor things, they could afford themselves throughout the week. She dressed in a smart little cap and gown that cost probably not more than 25 sous the ell, but made by herself, and that so tastily that it became her as much as though it had been made of satin. He, mind you, dressed and looking like a regular gentleman."
"And M. Germain has not been to see Mademoiselle Rigolette, I suppose, since he quitted the house?"
"No, monsieur, unless on Sunday, for Mademoiselle Rigolette has no time during the other 6 days of her week to think of sweethearting. Why, the poor girl rises at 5 or 6 o'clock, and works incessantly till 10 or 11 o'clock at night, never once leaving her room except for a few minutes in the morning, when she goes out to buy food for herself and her 2 canary birds. And the 3 eat but very little, just a pennyworth of milk, a little bread, some chickweed, birdseed, and clear fresh water. And the whole 3 of them sing away as merrily as though they fared ever so sumptuously. And Mademoiselle Rigolette is kind and charitable too, as far as lies in her power. That is to say, she gives her time, her sleep, and her services. For, poor girl, she can scarcely manage to keep herself by working closely for 12 hours a day. Those poor unfortunate creatures in the attics, whom Monsieur Bras Rouge is going to turn into the streets in 2 or 3 days' time, if even he waits so long. Why, Mademoiselle Rigolette and Monsieur Germain sat up with the children night after night."
"You have a distressed family, then, here?"
"Distressed? Oh, God bless you, my good sir, I think we have indeed. Why, there are only 5 young children, an almost dying mother, an idiotic grandmother, and their only support a man who, though he slaves like a negro, cannot even get bread enough to eat. And a capital workman he is, too. 3 hours' sleep out of the 24 is all he allows himself. And what sleep it is! Broken by his children crying for food, by the groans of his sick wife tossing on her miserable straw bed, or the idiotic screams of the poor bedridden old grandmother, who sometimes howls like a wolf. From hunger, too, for, poor creature, she has not sense or reason to know better. And when she gets very hungry, you may hear cries and screams all down the staircase."
"Horrible!" exclaimed Rodolphe with a shudder. "And does no one afford them any assistance?"
"Truly, sir, we do all we can. We are but poor ourselves. However, since the commandant has allowed me his paltry 12 francs a month for looking after his apartments, I have managed once a week to make a little broth for these poor unfortunate creatures. Mademoiselle Rigolette deprives herself of her night's rest, and sits up, poor girl, though it burns her candles, contriving out of one bit and the other of her cutting out to make up a few clothes for the children, Sometimes from the morsels left of her work she manages a small nightcap or gown. And Monsieur Germain, who had not a franc more than he knew what to do with, used to pretend from time to time that he had received a present of a few bottles of wine from his friends, and Morel, that is the name of the workman with the sick family, was sure to be invited to share it with him, and it was really wonderful to see how refreshed and strengthened poor Morel used to seem after Monsieur Germain had made him take a good pull at his wine, to put, as he used to say, a little life and soul into his half-exhausted body.
And the surgeon-dentist, what did he do for this wretched family?
Monsieur Bradamanti, said the porter. Oh, he cured my rheumatism, and I owe him my eternal gratitude. But from that day I said to my wife, Anastasia, Monsieur Bradamanti, did I not say so, Anastasia?
Exactly, that's precisely what you did say.
But I want to know what this Monsieur Bradamanti did to assist the poor starving beings in your garrets.
Why, you see, monsieur, when I mentioned to Monsieur Bradamanti the misery and utter destitution of poor Morel, by the way, he first began the conversation by complaining that the raving and screaming of the old idiot woman throughout the night for food prevented him from sleeping, and that he found it very unpleasant. However, he listened to my description of the state the whole family was in, and then he said, well, if they're so much distressed, you may tell them that if they want any teeth drawn, I will excuse them from paying even for the 6th.
I tell you what, Madame Pipelet, said Rodolphe, I have a decidedly bad opinion of this man. And your female pawnbroker, was she more charitable?
Very much after the fashion of Monsieur Bradamanti, said the portress. She lent a few sous on their wretched clothes. Every garment they had has passed into her hands, and even their last mattress. But they were not long coming to the last, for they never had but 2.
But she gave them no further aid.
Help them poor creatures, not she. Mother Burette is as great a brute in her way as her lover, Monsieur Bras Rouge, is in his. For between you and I,
added the portress, with an uncommonly knowing wink of the eye and sagacious shake of the head,
there is something rather tender going on between those 2.
Really? Cried Rodolphe.
I think so, or I do, upon my life. And why not? Why, the folks in Saint Martin are as loving as the rest of the world, are they not, my old pet?
A melancholy shake of the head, which produced a corresponding motion in the huge black hat, was M. Pipelet's only answer. As for Madame Pipelet, since she had begun expressing sympathy for the poor sufferers in the attics, her countenance had ceased to strike Rodolphe as repulsive, and he even thought it wore an agreeable expression. And what is this poor Morel's trade?
A maker of false jewellery. He works by the piece, but, dear me, that sort of work is so much imitated and so cheaply got up that, for a man can but work his best, and he cannot do more than he can. Besides, when you have got to find bread for 7 persons without reckoning yourself, it's rather a hard job, I take it. And though his eldest daughter does her best to assist the family, she has but very little in her power.
How old is this daughter?
About 18, and as lovely a young creature as you would see in a long summer's day. She lives as servant with an old miserly fellow, rich enough to buy and sell half Paris, a notary, named Monsieur Jacques Ferrand.
Monsieur Jacques Ferrand? Exclaimed Rodolphe, surprised at the fresh coincidence which brought under his notice the very individual from whom, or from whose confidential housekeeper, he expected to glean so many particulars relative to La Goualeuse. Monsieur Jacques Ferrand, who lives in the Rue du Sentier, do you mean? Inquired he.
The very same. Are you acquainted with him?
Not at all, but he does the law business for the firm I belong to.
Ah, then you must know that he's a regular money-grabbing old usurer. But then, let me do the man justice, he's strictly religious, and devout as a monk, never absent from mass or vespers, making his Easter offerings, and going regularly to confession. If he ever enjoys himself, it's only along with the priests, drinking holy water and eating blessed bread. Oh, he's almost a saint in the strictness of his life, but then his heart is as hard as iron, and as stern and rigid towards others as he is severe towards himself. Why, poor Louise, daughter to our sick lodger, has been his only servant for the last 18 months. And what a good girl she is! Gentle as a lamb in temper and disposition, but willing as a horse to work. And he only gives the poor thing, who slaves herself to death for him, 18 francs a month. Not a farthing more, I give you my word. And out of this she only keeps back 6 francs for her own maintenance, and hands over the other 12 to her starving family. That has been all their dependence for some time past. But when 7 persons have to live upon it, it doesn't go far.
But what does the father earn? I mean, providing he's industrious.
Industrious? God bless you, he's always overworked himself. He's the soberest, steadiest creature alive. And I verily believe that if he had the promise of obtaining any favour he liked to ask of heaven, it would be that the day might be made doubly as long as it now is, that he might earn bread enough to stop the cries of his starving brats.
Then the father cannot earn enough if he were to try ever so hard, it seems.
Why, the poor man was ill abed for 3 months, and that threw them all behind. His wife's health was quite ruined by the fatigue of nursing him, and the severe want she experienced of common necessaries for herself and family. She now lies in a dying state, and they have had nothing for all that period besides Louise's wages, and what they could obtain from Mother Burette on the few wretched articles they could dispose of. True, the master for whom Morel had worked advanced him a trifle out of respect for a man he'd always found punctual and honest when he could work. But 8 people only to be found in bread, that's what I say. Just imagine how hard it must be to keep life and soul together in such small means. And if you could only see the hole they are huddled together in. But do not let us talk any more about that, monsieur, for our dinner's ready, and the very thought of their wretched garret turns my stomach. However, happily, Monsieur Bras Rouge is going to clear the house of them. When I say happily, I don't mean it ill-naturedly in the least. But since these poor Morels have fallen into such misery, and it's quite out of our power to help them, why, let them go and be miserable elsewhere. It'll be a heartache the less for us all.
But if they are turned out from here, where will they go to?
Truly, I don't know.
And how much can this poor workman earn daily when in health, and without any calls upon his time or attention?
Why, if he had not to attend to his old mother, nurse his sick wife, and look after the 5 children, he could earn his 3 or 4 francs a day, because he works like a downright slave. But now that at least 3/4 of his time are taken up with the family, he can hardly manage to earn 40 sous.
That is little indeed. Poor creatures.
Yes, it's easy to say poor creatures, but there are so many equally poor creatures that, as we can do nothing for them, it's no use to worry ourselves about it. Is it, Alfred? And talking of consoling ourselves, there stands the cassia, and we have never thought of tasting it.
To tell you the truth, Madame Pipelet, after what I have just heard, I have no inclination to partake of it. You and Monsieur Pipelet must drink my health in it when I am gone.
You are extremely kind, sir,
said the porter.
But will you not like to see the room upstairs?
I shall be glad to do so, if perfectly convenient, and if they suit, I will engage them at once and leave a deposit. The porter, followed by Rodolphe, emerged from the gloomy lodge and proceeded upstairs. End of Part 2 of Chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1, by Eugène Sue, Chapter 24. The 4 Stories. The damp, dark staircase looked still more gloomy through the fog of a November day. The entrance to each separate set of apartments in this house bore its own peculiar and distinctive character to the observant eye. Thus, the door conducting to those of the commandment bore evidences of having been recently painted in close imitation of ebony, being further set off with the brass knob, rubbed up to a most dazzling brightness, while a gay-coloured bell-rope, finished by an enormous tassel of scarlet silk, contrasted strongly with the mean and shabby wall against which it hung. The door of the flight above, where dwelt the female money-lender and dealer in divination, was singularly characterized by the appearance of that mystical symbol of deep wisdom and oracular knowledge, an owl, which, suffered to resemble life as closely as the artist could contrive it, was nailed on a small bracket just above the doorway, while a sort of small wicket, latticed with wire work, enabled all visitors to be duly scrutinized ere they were admitted. The dwelling of the Italian charlatan, who was said to pursue such fearful avocations, had likewise its whimsical mode of designating the pursuits of its occupant, whose name, traced in large letters, formed of horses' teeth upon a square blackboard, was nailed to the entrance door, while, instead of adopting the classical agency of a deer's foot or a hare's pad for the handle of his bell, there hung, dangling from the cord, the hand and arm of a dried ape. The withered limb, the shrivelled hand with its 5 fingers, each so distinctly preserved, and the articulation of every joint so clearly defined, the tiny tips, bearing the nails long and taper as those of a human creature, presented a close and hideous resemblance to the hand and arm of a child. As Rodolphe passed before a door so singularly indicative of all his worst suspicions, he fancied he could detect the sound of smothered sobs from within. Then rose up a cry so full of agony, of convulsive, irrepressible misery, a cry as if wrung from a breaking heart or the last wail of expiring nature, that the whole house seemed to re-echo it. Rodolphe started. Then, by a movement more rapid than thought itself, he rushed to the door and violently pulled the bell. "What's the matter, sir?" inquired the astonished porter. "That cry," said Rodolphe. "Did you not hear it?" Yes, I heard it. I dare say it is some person whose teeth Monsieur Bradamante is taking out. Perhaps he may be taking out several, and it is painful." This explanation, though a probable one, did not satisfy Rodolphe as to the horrid scream which still resounded in his ears, though he had rung the bell with considerable violence. No person had as yet replied to his summons. He could distinctly hear the shutting of several doors, and then, behind a small oval glass let in beside the door, and on which Rodolphe had mechanically kept his eyes fixed, he saw the haggard, cadaverous countenance of a human being. A mass of reddish hair, strongly mixed with grey, and a long beard of the same hue, completed the hideous ensemble. The face was seen but for an instant, and vanished as quickly as though it had been a mere creation of fancy, leaving Rodolphe in a state of perturbation impossible to describe. Short as had been the period of this apparition's visit, he had yet in those brief instants recalled features precisely similar and forever engraved on his memory. The eyes shining with the colour and brilliancy of the aquamarina beneath their bushy, sandy eyebrows, the livid complexion, the nose thin, projecting and curving like an eagle's beak, with its nostrils so curiously expanded and carved out till they exposed a portion of the nasal cartilage, resembled closely a certain Polidori, whose name had been so unceremoniously committed by Murphy, in his conversation with Garon, to regions not mentionable to polite ears, though Rodolphe had not seen Polidori during the last 16 or 17 years. He had 1,000 reasons for keeping every feature well in his remembrance, The only thing that told against the identity of the individual he believed existed under the disguised name of this quack dentist was the circumstance of his having red hair, while the Polidori of Rodolph's acquaintance had almost black. That Rodolphe experienced no wonder, always supposing his conjectures as to the identity correct, at finding a man whose profound learning, rare talent, and vast intelligence he well knew sunk to such a degradation, it might even be infamy, was because he knew equally well that all these high attainments and noble gifts were allied to such entire perversity, such wild and irregular passions, inclinations so corrupt, and affected scorn and contempt for the opinion of the world, which might lead this man, when want and misery overtook him, to seek, from choice, the lowest and least honourable paths of subsistence, and to enjoy a sort of malevolent satisfaction in the idea of him, the talented, the learned, buying all these precious treasures beneath the ignoble call to which he had devoted his vast powers of mind and body. Still be it remembered that, spite of the close resemblance between the charlatan surgeon-dentist and the Polidori of bygone years, there still existed discrepancies so great that Rodolphe balanced in deep uncertainty respecting their proving to be one and the same person. At length, turning to Pipelet, he inquired, "How long has this Monsieur Bradamanti been with an inmate of this house?" "About a year, sir, as nearly as I can remember." "Yes, it is a year. I recollect he took the lodgings in the January quarter. Oh, he is a very regular and exact lodger. He cured me of a desperate attack of rheumatism. Madame Pipelet was telling me of the reports which are circulated of him. How could she be so foolish? Nay, pray do not fear me. I assure you I may safely be trusted." "But really, sir," rejoined Pipelet, "I do not think there is the least dependence to be placed in such reports. I do not believe them, for one. I never can believe them. My modesty would not let me," added Monsieur Pipelet, turning very red, and preceding his new lodger to the floor above, the more resolved upon clearing up his doubts in proportion to the very great annoyance he felt that the residence of the Polidori in the same house would prove to him, and becoming momentarily more disposed to affix a painful solution to the enigma of the piercing cry he had heard from the apartments of the Italian, Rodolphe bound himself by a rigid promise to investigate the matter, so as to place it beyond the power of a doubt, and followed the porter to the upper floor, where was situated the chamber he was desirous of engaging. It was easy to ascertain the abode of his next-door neighbour Mademoiselle Rigolette, thanks to the charming gallantry of the painter, Pipelet's mortal foe. The door of her chamber was ornamented after the manner of Watteau, with a panel design representing about half a dozen fat little chubby loves grouped round a space painted sky blue, and on which was traced, in pink letters, Mademoiselle Rigolette, dressmaker. These plump little cupids had all a task to perform besides encircling this important announcement. One held the thimble of Mademoiselle Rigolette upon his tiny finger, another held her scissors, a third provided with a smoothing iron for her use, whilst a fourth held up a mirror, as if to tempt the young sempstress to forsake her work for the more gratifying view of her own pretty countenance. The whole was surrounded with a well-chosen wreath of flowers, whose gay colours contrasted agreeably with the sea-green colour of the door, the whole offering a very unfavourable contrast to the man and shabby-looking staircase. At the risk of opening anew the bleeding wounds of Alfred, Rodolphe ventured to observe, while pointing to the door of Mademoiselle Rigolette, This, I suppose, is the work of Monsieur Caron. It is. He destroyed the painting of the door by daubing it over with a parcel of fat. Indecent children he called his loves. Had it not been for the entreaties of Mademoiselle Rigolette and the weaknesses of Monsieur Bras Rouge, I would have scratched it all off, as well as this palette filled with horrid monsters, with their equally abominable master, whom you can see drawn amongst them. You may know him by his steeple-crowned hat. And there, sure enough, on the door of the room Rodolphe was about to hire, might be seen a palette surrounded by all kinds of odd and whimsical creatures, the witty conceit of which might have done honour to Klett. Rodolphe followed the porter into a tolerably good-sized room, accessible by a small entrance closet, or antechamber, having 2 windows opening into the Rue du Temple. Some fantastic sketches from the pencil of Monsieur Caron on the second door had been scrupulously respected by Monsieur Germain. Rodolphe saw too many reasons for desiring to obtain this lodging to hesitate further. Therefore, modestly placing a couple of francs in the hand of the porter, he said, "This chamber will exactly suit me. Here is the deposit to complete the bargain. Tomorrow I will send in my furniture. But let me beg of you not to destroy the merry creatures painted on the palette of the entrance. It is really very droll, don't you think so?" "Droll!" groaned poor Pipelet. "Not I. Ah, sir, how would you like to dream, night after night, that you are being hunted by a legion of little ugly devils like these on the door, with Caron at their head urging them on, and then fancying you are trying to get away, and cannot? Oh, I have woke, all in a perspiration, of such dreams hundreds of times since that infamous Caron began persecuting me. Why, honestly speaking, I cannot say the chase would be a very agreeable one, even though but a dream. However, tell me, have I any need to see Monsieur Bras Rouge, your great man here, about renting this apartment?" "None whatever, sir. He rarely comes near the place, except when he has any private matters to arrange with Mother Brouette. I am the only person to treat with about hiring apartments. I must beg the favour of your name." "Rodolphe." "Rodolphe what?" "Plain Rodolphe. Monsieur Pipelet. Nothing more, if you please." "Just as you please, sir. I did not ask from curiosity. Every man has a right to his own free will, as well as to decide upon the name he chooses to be called. What do you think, Monsieur Pipelet, as to the propriety of my going to-morrow as a new neighbour of Morel's to inquire whether I can be of any service to them? Since my predecessor, Monsieur Germain, was permitted to assist them according to his means, why should they not accept of what trifling help I can afford?" "Why, sir, I see no harm in your going to call the Morels, because it may please the poor things that I hardly see much good it can do, as they are so shortly to be turned out of the house." Then, as if suddenly struck with the new idea, Monsieur Pipelet exclaimed, winking at Rodolphe with what he intended should be a very facetious and penetrating look, I see. You mean to begin making acquaintance with the lodgers at the top of the house, that you may be able to work your way down to Mademoiselle Rigolette. Ah, I found you, you see, pretty girl. Well, I think you have discovered my intentions, so I will confess at once that I mean to try and be on friendly terms with my agreeable neighbour. There is no harm in that, sir. It is customary, only all correct, all right and honourable. You understand. Between you and me, I strongly suspect Mademoiselle Rigolette heard us coming upstairs, and that she is watching to have a look as we go down. I will make a noise purposely in locking the door. If you look sharp, you will see her as we pass the landing, and, true to the porter's suspicious, the door so tastefully enlivened by the fat cupids à la Watteau was seen to open gently, and Rodolphe had a brief view of a little turned-up nose, and a pair of large staring black eyes peeping through the narrow space. But as he slackened his steps, the door was hastily shut. "I told you she was watching us," said the porter, then added, "Excuse me one instant, sir. I want to step up to my warehouse." "Where is that?" "At the top of this ladder is the landing place, on which the door of Morel's garret opens, and in the wainscoting of this landscape is a small dark cupboard, where I keep my leather, and the wall is so full of cracks that when I am in this hole I can see and hear everything, the same as if I was in Morel's room. Not that I wish to spy what the poor creatures are about, God knows, quite the contrary. But please to excuse me for a few minutes, sir, whilst I fetch my bit of leather. If you will have the goodness to go downstairs, I will rejoin you." And so saying, Pipelet commenced ascending the steep ladder communicating with his warehouse, as he styled it, a somewhat perilous feat for a person of his age. Rodolphe, thus left alone, cast another glance toward the chambers of Mademoiselle Rigolette, remembering with deep interest all he had heard of her being the favourite companion of the four Goualeuse, and recalling also the information she was said to possess touching the residence of the schoolmaster's son, when the sound of some person quitting the apartments of the quack doctor below attracted his attention, and he could distinctly hear the light step of a female, with the rustling of a silk dress. Rodolphe paused till the sounds had died away, and then descended the stairs. Something white had fallen about halfway down. It had evidently been dropped by the person who had just quitted Polidori. Rodolphe picked it up, and carried it to one of the narrow windows which lighted the staircase. It was a pocket handkerchief, of the finest cambric, trimmed with costly lace, and bearing in one corner the initials L.N., beautifully embroidered, and surmounted with a ducal coronet. The handkerchief was literally soaked in tears. Rodolphe's first impulse was to follow the person from whose hand this mute evidence of deep woe had fallen, with the view of restoring it. But reflecting that such a step might be mistaken for impertinent curiosity, he determined to preserve it carefully, as the first link in an adventure he found himself almost involuntarily engaged in, and from which he augured a painful and melancholy termination. As he returned to the porteress, he inquired whether a female had not just come downstairs. "A female? No, indeed, sir. It was a fine, tall, slender-looking lady, not a female, and covered over with a thick black veil. She has come from Monsieur Bradamante. Little Tortillard fetched a coach for her, and she has just driven away in it. What struck me was the impudence of that little beggar to seat himself behind the coach. I dare say, though, it was to see where the lady went to, for he is as mischievous as a magpie, and as praying as a ferret, for all his club foot." "So then," thought Rodolphe, "the name and address of this unhappy lady will soon be known to this impostor, since it is, doubtless, by his directions she is followed and watched by this imp of an emissary. Well, sir, and what do you think of the apartment? Will it suit you?" inquired Madame Pipelet. "Nothing could have suited me better. I have taken it, and tomorrow I shall send in my furniture." "Well, then, thank God for a good lodger. I am sure it was a lucky chance for us sent you here." "I hope you will find it so, madame. I think it is well understood between us that you undertake to manage all my little domestic matters for me. I shall come and superintend the removal of my goods. Adieu." So saying, Rodolphe left the lodge. The results of his visit to the house in the Rue du Temple were highly important, both as regarded the solution of the deep mystery he so ardently desired to unravel, and also as affording a wide field for the exercise of his earnest endeavours to do good and to prevent evil. After mature calculation, he considered himself to have achieved the following results. First, he had ascertained that Mademoiselle Rigolette was in possession of the address of Germain, the schoolmaster's son. Secondly, a young female, who, from appearances, might unhappily be the Marquise de Harville, had made an appointment with the commandant for the morrow, perhaps to her own utter ruin and disgrace, and Rodolphe had, as we have before mentioned, numerous reasons for wishing to preserve the honour and peace of one for whom he felt so lively an interest as he took in all concerning Monsieur de Harville, an honest, industrious artisan, crushed by the deepest misery, was with his whole family about to be turned into the streets through the means of brass rogue. Further, Rodolphe had unsightingly caught a glimpse of an adventure in which the charlatan Cesar Bradamante, possibly Polidori, and a female, evidently of rank and fashion, were the principal actors, and finally La Chouette, having lately quitted the hospital, where she had been since the affair in the Allée des Veuves, had reappeared on the stage, and was evidently engaged in some underhand proceedings with the fortune-teller and female money-leader who occupied the second floor of the house. Having carefully noted down all these particulars, Rodolphe returned to his house, Rue Plumet, deferring till the following day his visit to the notary, Jacques Ferrand. It will be no doubt fresh in the memory of our readers, that on this same evening Rodolphe was engaged to be present at a grand ball given by the ambassador of Blanc. Before following our hero in this new excursion, let us cast a retrospective glance on Tom and Sarah, personages of the greatest importance in the development of his history. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25, Part 1 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1, by Eugène Sue. Chapter 25, Tom and Sarah, Part 1. Sarah Seyton, widow of Count Macgregor, and, at this time 36 or 37 years of age, was of an excellent Scotch family, daughter of a baronet, and a country gentleman. Beautiful and accomplished, an orphan at 17 years old, she had left Scotland with her brother, Thomas Seyton of Halsbury. The absurd predictions of an old Highland nurse had excited almost to madness the two leading vices in Sarah's character, pride and ambition. The destiny predicted for her, and which she fully believed, was of the highest order, in fact, sovereign rank. The prophecy had been so often repeated that the young Scotch girl eventually fully credited its fulfilment, and she constantly repeated to herself, to bear out her ambitious dream, that a fortune-teller had thus promised a crown to the handsome and excellent creature who afterwards sat on the throne of France, and who was queen as much by her graces and her kind heart as others have been by their grandeur and majesty. Strange to say, Thomas Seyton, as superstitious as his sister, encouraged her foolish hopes, and resolved on devoting his life to the realization of Sarah's dream, a dream as dazzling as it was deceptive. However, the brother and sister were not so blind as to believe implicitly in this Highland prophecy, and to look absolutely for a throne of the first rank in a splendid disdain of secondary royalties or reigning principalities. On the contrary, so that the handsome Scotch lassie should one day encircle her imperial forehead with a sovereign crown, the haughty pair agreed to condescend to shut their eyes to the importance of the throne they coveted. By the assistance of the Almanac de Gotha for the year of grace 1819, Seyton arranged, before he left Scotland, a sort of synopsis of the ages of all the kings and ruling powers in Europe then unmarried. Although very ridiculous, yet the brother and sister's ambition was freed from all shameful modes. Satan was prepared to aid his sister Sarah in snatching at the thread of the conjugal band by which she hoped eventually to fasten a crown upon her brows. He would be her participator in any and all stratagems which could tend to consummate this end, but he would rather have killed his sister than see her the mistress of a prince, even though the liaison should terminate in a marriage of reparation. The matrimonial inventory that resulted from Satan and Sarah's researches in the Almanach de Gotha was satisfactory. The Germanic Confederation furnished forth a numerous contingent of young presumptive sovereigns. Satan was not ignorant of the sort of German wedlock which is called a left-handed marriage, to which, as being legitimate to a certain extent, he would, as a last resource, have resigned his sister. To Germany, then, it was resolved to bend their steps, in order to commence this search for the royal spouse. If the project appears improbable, such hopes ridiculous, let us first reply by saying that unbridled ambition, excited by superstitious belief, rarely claims for itself the light of reason in its enterprises, and will dare the wildest impossibilities. Yet, when we recall certain events, even in our own times, from high and most reputable morganatic marriages between sovereigns and female subjects, down to the loving elopement of Miss Penelope Smith and the Prince of Capua, we cannot refuse some chance of fortunate result to the imagination of Satan and Sarah. Let us add that the lady united to a very lovely person singular abilities and very varied talents, whilst there were added a power of seduction the more dangerous as it was united to a mind unbending and calculating, a disposition cunning and selfish, a deep hypocrisy, a stubborn and despotic will, all covered by the outward show of a generous, warm, and impassioned nature. In her appearance there was as much deceit as in her mind. Her full and dark eyes, now sparkling, now languishing, beneath her coal-black brow, could well dissimulate all the warmth of love and desire. Yet the burning impulses of love never throbbed beneath her icy bosom. No surprise of the heart or of the senses ever intervened to disturb the cold and pitiless calculations of this woman, crafty, selfish, and ambitious. When she reached the Continent, she resolved, in accordance with her brother's advice, not to commence her conjugal and regal campaign until she had resided some time in Paris, where she determined to complete her education and rub off the rust of her native country by associating with a society which was embellished by all that was elegant, tasteful, and refined. Sarah was introduced into the best society and the highest circles, thanks to the letters of recommendation and considerate patronage of the English ambassador's lady and the old Marquis d'Arville, who had known Tom and Sarah's father in England. Persons of deceitful, calculating, and cold dispositions acquire with great facility language and manners quite in opposition to their natural character, as with them all is outside, surface, appearance, varnish, bark, or they soon find that, if their real characters are detected, they are undone. So, thanks to the sort of instinct of self-preservation with which they are gifted, they feel all the necessity of the moral mask, and so paint and costume themselves with the alacrity and skill of a practised comedian. Thus, after 6 months' residence in Paris, Sarah was in a condition to contest with the most Parisian of Parisian women as to the piquant finish of her wit, the charm of her liveliness, the ingenuousness of her flirtation, and the exciting simplicity of her looks, at once chaste and passionate. Finding his sister in full panoply for his campaign, Satan left with her for Germany, furnished with the best letters of introduction. The first state of the German Confederation which headed Sarah's road book was the Grand Duchy of Gérolstein, thus styled in the diplomatic and infallible Almanach de Gotha for the year of grace 1819. Genealogy of the sovereigns of Europe and their families. Gérolstein. Grand Duke Maximilian Rodolphe, 10th of December, 1764. Succeeded his father, Charles Frederick Rodolphe, 21st of April, 1785. Widower, January 1808, by decease of his wife, Louisa Amelia, daughter of John Augustus, Prince of Burglen. Son, Gustavus Rodolphe, born 17th April 1803. Mother, Dowager Grand Duchess Judith, widow of the Grand Duke, Charles Frederick Rodolphe, 21st April 1785. Seyton, with much practical good sense, had first noted down on his list the youngest princes, whom he coveted as brothers-in-law, thinking that extreme youth is more easily seduced than ripened age. Moreover, we have already said that the brother and sister were particularly recommended to the reigning Duke of Gerolstein by the old Marquis d'Harville, caught, like the rest of the world, by Sarah, whose beauty, grace, and above all delightful manners he could not sufficiently admire. It is superfluous to say that the presumptive heir of the Grand Duchy of Gerolstein was Gustavus Rodolphe. He was hardly 18 when Tom and Sarah were presented to his father. The arrival of the young Scotch lady was an event in the German court, so quiet, simple, and almost patriarchal in its habits and observances. The Grand Duke, a most worthy gentleman, governed his states with wise firmness and paternal kindness. Nothing could exceed the actual and moral happiness of the principality, whose laborious and steady population, by their soberness and piety, presented a pure specimen of the German character. This excellent people enjoyed so much real felicity, and were so perfectly contented with their condition, that the enlightened care of the Grand Duke was not much called into action to preserve them from the mania of constitutional innovations. As far as modern discovery went, and those practical suggestions which have a wholesome influence over the well-being and morals of his people, the Grand Duke was always anxious to acquire knowledge himself, and apply it invariably for the use and benefit of his people, his residence at the capitals of the different states of Europe having little else to occupy themselves whilst on their mission, but to keep their master fully informed as to the rise and progress of science and all the arts which are connected with public welfare and public utility. We have said that the Duke felt as much affection as gratitude for the old Marquis d'Harville, who, in 1815, had rendered him immense service. And so, thanks to his powerful recommendation, Sarah of Holsbury and her brother were received at the court of Gerolstein with every distinction and with marked kindness. A fortnight after her arrival, the young Scotch girl, endued with so profound a spirit of observation, had easily penetrated the firm character and open heart of the Grand Duke. Before she began to seduce his son, a thing of course, she had wisely resolved to discover the disposition of the father. Although he had appeared to dote on his son, she was yet fully convinced that this father, with all his tenderness, would never swerve from certain principles, certain ideas as to the duty of princes, and would never consent to what he would consider a misalliance for his son, and that not through pride, but from conscience, reason, and dignity. A man of this firm mould, and the more affectionate and good in proportion as he is firm and determined, never abates one jot of that which affects his conscience, his reason, and his dignity. Sarah was on the point of renouncing her enterprise in the face of obstacles so insurmountable, but reflecting that, as Rodolphe was so very young, and his gentleness and goodness, his character at once timid and meditative, were generally spoken of, she thought she might find compensation in the feeble and irresolute disposition of the young prince, and therefore persisted in her project, and again revived her hopes. On this new essay, the management of herself and brother were most masterly. The young lady knew full well how to propitiate all around her, and particularly the persons who might have been jealous or envious of her accomplishments. And she caused her beauty and grace to be forgotten beneath the veil of modest simplicity with which she covered them. She soon became the idol, not only of the Grand Duke, but of his mother, the Dowager Grand Duchess Judith, who, in spite of, or through her 90 years of age, loved to excess everything that was young and charming. Sarah and her brother often talked of their departure, but the sovereign of Gerolstein would never consent to it, and that he might completely attach the two of them to him, he pressed on Sir Thomas Seyton, the acceptance of the vacant post of his first groom of the chamber, and entreated Sarah not to quit the Grand Duchess Judith, as she could not do without her. After much hesitation, overcome by the most pressing entreaties, Sarah and Seyton accepted such brilliant offers, and decided on establishing themselves at the court of Gerolstein, where they had been for 2 months. Sarah, who was an accomplished musician, knowing the taste of the Grand Duchess for the old masters, and above all for Gluck, sent for the chef-d'œuvre of this attractive composer, and fascinated the old princess by her unfailing complaisance, as well as the remarkable skill with which she sang those old airs, so beautiful in their melody, so expressive in their character. As for Seyton, he knew how to make himself very useful in the occupation which had been conferred upon him. He was a good judge of horses, was orderly and firm in his conduct and arrangements, and so, in a short time, completely remodelled the stables of the Grand Duke, which, up to that time, had been neglected and become disorganised. The brother and sister were soon equally beloved, feted, and admired in this court. The master's preference soon commands the preference of those below him. Sarah required, in aid of her future projects, too much aid not to employ her insinuating powers in acquiring partisans. Her hypocrisy, clothed in most attractive shapes, easily deluded the simple-hearted Germans, and the general feeling soon authorised the extreme kindness of the Grand Duke. Thus, then, our designing pair were established at the court of Gerolstein, agreeably and securely placed without any reference to Rodolphe. By a lucky chance, some days after the arrival of Sarah, the young prince had gone away to the inspection of troops, with an aide-de-camp and the faithful Murphy. This absence, doubly auspicious to the views of Sarah, allowed her to arrange at her ease the principal threads of the fillet she was weaving, without being deterred by the presence of the young prince, whose too open admiration might, perhaps, have awakened the suspicions of the Grand Duke. On the contrary, in the absence of his son, he did not, unfortunately, reflect that he was admitting into the closest intimacy a young girl of surpassing beauty and lively wit, as Rodolphe must discover at every moment of the day. Sarah was perfectly insensible to a reception so kind and generous, to the full confidence with which she was introduced into the very heart of this sovereign family. Neither brother nor sister paused for a moment in their bad designs. They determined upon a principle to bring trouble and annoyance into this peaceable and happy court. They calmly calculated the probable results of the cruel divisions they should establish between a father and son, up to that period so tenderly united. A few words concerning Rodolphe's early days may be necessary. During his infancy he had been extremely delicate. His father reasoned thereon in this strange manner. English country gentlemen are generally remarkable for their robust health. This advantage results generally from their bodily training, which is simple, rural, and develops their full vigour. Rodolphe must leave the hands of women. His temperament is delicate, and, perhaps by accustoming this child to live like the son of an English farmer, with some few exceptions, I shall strengthen his constitution. The Grand Duke sent to England for a man worthy of the trust, and capable of directing such a course of bodily culture, and Sir Walter Murphy, an athletic specimen of a Yorkshire country gentleman, was entrusted with this important charge. The direction which he gave to the mind and body of the young prince was such as entirely coincided with the views and wishes of the Grand Duke. Murphy and his pupil lived for many years in a beautiful farmhouse, situated in the midst of woods and fields, some leagues from the capital of Gerolstein, and in a most picturesque and salubrious spot. Rodolphe, free from all etiquette, and employed with Murphy in outdoor labour proportionate to his age, lived the sober, manly, and regular life of the country, having for his pleasure and amusement the violent exercises of wrestling, pugilism, riding on horseback, and hunting. In the midst of the pure air of the meadows, woods, and mountains, he underwent an entire change, and grew up as vigorous as a young oak. His pale cheek became suffused with the ruddy glow of health. Always lithe and active, He underwent now the most severe fatigues, his address, energy, and courage supplying what was deficient in his muscular power, so that when only in his 15th or 16th year, he was always the conqueror in his contests with young men his superiors in age. His scientific education necessarily suffered from the preference given to his physical training, and Rodolphe's knowledge was very limited, but the Grand Duke very wisely reflected that to have a well-informed mind it must be supported by a strong physical frame, and that, this acquired, the intellectual faculties would develop themselves the more rapidly. The kind Walter Murphy was by no means a sage, and could only convey to Rodolphe some primary instruction, but no one knew better than he how to inspire his pupil with the feeling of what is just, loyal, and generous, and a horror of everything that was mean, low, and contemptible. These repugnances, these powerful and wholesome admonitions, took deep and lasting root in the very soul of Rodolphe, and although in after life these principles were violently shaken by the storm of passions, yet they were never eradicated from his heart. The levin bolt strikes, splits, and rends the deeply planted tree, but the sap still maintains its hold in the roots, and 1,000 green branches spring fresh from what was taken for a withered and dead tree. Murphy, then, gave to Rodolphe, if we may use the expression, health to both body and mind. He made him robust, active, and daring, with a love for all that was good and right, and a hatred for whatsoever was wicked and bad. Having fulfilled his task to admiration, the squire, called to England on very important business, left Germany for some time, to the great regret of Rodolphe, who loved him extremely. His son's health having been so satisfactorily established, the Grand Duke turned his most serious attention to the mental education of his dearly beloved son. A certain Dr. Caesar Polidori, a renowned linguist, a distinguished chemist, learned historian, and deeply versed in the study of all the exact and physical sciences, was entrusted with the charge of cultivating and improving the rich but virgin soil, so carefully and well prepared by Murphy. This time the Grand Duke's choice was a most unfortunate one, or rather his religious feelings were infamously imposed upon by the person who introduced the doctor to him, and caused him to think on Polidori as the preceptor of the young prince. Atheist, cheat, and hypocrite, full of stratagem and trick, concealing the most dangerous immorality, the most hardened scepticism, under an austere exterior, profoundly versed in the knowledge of human nature, or rather only having tried the worst side, the disgraceful passions of humanity, Dr. Polidori was the most hateful mentor that could have been entrusted with the education of a young man. Rodolphe left with the deepest regrets the independent and animating life which he had hitherto led with Murphy, to go and become pale with the study of books, and submit himself to the irksome ceremonies of his father's court, and he at once entertained a strong prejudice against his tutor. It could not be otherwise. On quitting his young friend, the poor squire had compared him, and with justice, to a young wild colt, full of grace and fire, carried off from his native prairies, where he had dwelt free as air and joyous as a bird, to be bridled and spurred, that he might under that system learn how to moderate and economize those powers which, hitherto, he had only employed in running and leaping in any way he pleased. Rodolphe began by telling Polidori that he had no taste for study, but that he greatly preferred the free exercise of his arms and legs, to breathe the pure air of the fields, to traverse the woods and the mountains, and that a good horse and a good gun were preferable to all the books in the universe. The doctor was prepared for this antipathy, and was secretly delighted at it, for, in another way, the hopes of this man were as ambitious as those of Sarah. Although the Grand Duchy of Gérolstein was only a secondary state, Polidori indulged the idea of being one day its Richelieu, and of making Rodolphe play the part of the do-nothing prince. But, desirous above all things of currying favour with his pupil, and of making him forget Murphy, by his own concession and compliance he concealed from the Grand Duke the young prince's repugnance for study, and boasted of his application to, and rapid progress in his studies, whilst some examinations arranged between himself and Rodolphe, which had the air of being impromptu questions, confirmed the Grand Duke in his blind and implicit confidence. By degrees, the dislike which Rodolphe at first entertained for the doctor changed, on the young prince's part, into a cool familiarity, very unlike the real attachment he had for Murphy. By degrees he found himself leagued with Polidori, although from very innocent causes, by the same ties that unite two guilty persons. Sooner or later Rodolphe was sure to despise a man of the age and character of the doctor, who so unworthily lied to excuse the idleness of his pupil. This Polidori knew, but he also knew that if we do not at once sever our connections with corrupt minds in disgust, by degrees, and in spite of our better reason, we become familiar with, and too frequently admire them, until insensibly we hear without shame or reproach those things mocked at and vituperated which we formerly loved and revered. Besides, the doctor was too cunning all at once to shock certain noble sentiments and convictions which Rodolphe had derived from the admirable lessons of Murphy. After having vented much raillery on the coarseness of the early occupations of his young pupil, the doctor, laying aside his thin mask of austerity, had greatly aroused the curiosity and heated the fancy of the young prince by the exaggerated descriptions, strongly drawn and deeply coloured, of the pleasures and gallantries which had illustrated the reigns of Louis XIV, the regent, and especially Louis XV, the hero of Caesar Polidori. He assured the misled boy, who listened to him with a fatal earnestness, that pleasures, however excessive, far from demoralising a highly accomplished prince, often made him merciful and generous, inasmuch as fine minds are never more predisposed to benevolence and clemency than when acted upon by their own enjoyments. Louis XV, the bien-aimé, the well-beloved, was an unanswerable proof of this. And then, added the doctor, how entirely have the greatest men of all ages and all countries abandoned themselves to the most refined Epicureanism, from Alcibiades to Maurice of Saxony, from Antony to the great Condé, from Caesar to Vendôme. Such conversations must make deep and dangerous impressions on a young, ardent, and virgin mind, and such theories could not be without their results. In the midst of this well-regulated and virtuous court, accustomed after the example of its ruler to honest pleasures and harmless amusements, Rodolphe, instructed by Polidori, dreamt of the dissipated nights of Versailles, the orgies of Choisy, the attractive voluptuousness of the Parc aux Cerfs, and also, from time to time, of some romantic amours contrasting with these. Neither had the doctor failed to prove to Rodolphe that a prince of the Germanic Confederation should not have any military pretension beyond sending his contingent to the Diet. The feeling of the time was not warlike. According to the doctor, to pass his time delightfully and idly amongst women and the refinements of luxury, to repose from time to time from the animation of sensual pleasures amidst the delightful attractions of the fine arts, to hunt occasionally, not as a Nimrod, but as an intelligent Epicurean, and enjoy the transitory fatigues which make idleness and repose taste but the sweeter. This was the only life which a prince should think of enjoying, who, and this was his height of happiness, could find a Prime Minister capable of devoting himself boldly to the distressing and overwhelming burden of state affairs. Rodolphe, in abandoning himself to ideas which were free from criminality, because they did not spring from the circle of fatal probabilities, resolved that when Providence should call to himself the Grand Duke, his father, he would devote himself to the life which Caesar Polidori had painted to him under such brilliant and attractive colours, and to have as his Prime Minister one whose knowledge and understanding he admired, and whose blind complaisance he fully appreciated. It is useless to say that the young prince kept the most perfect silence upon the subject of those pernicious hopes which had been excited within him. Knowing that the heroes of the Grand Duke's admiration were Gustavus Adolphus, Charles XII, and the great Frederick, Maximilian Rodolphe had the honour of belonging to the royal house of Brandenburg, Rodolphe thought, reasonably enough, that the prince, his father, who professed so profound an admiration for these king captains, always booted and spurred, continually mounted on their chargers, and engaged in making war, would consider his son out of his senses if he believed him capable of wishing to displace the Tedescan gravity of his court by the introduction of the light and licentious manners of the Regency. A year, 18 months, passed away. At the end of this time Murphy returned from England, and wept for joy on again embracing his young pupil. After a few days, although unable to discover the reason of a change which so deeply afflicted him, the worthy squire found Rodolphe chilled and constrained in his demeanour towards him, and almost rude when he recalled to him his sequestered and rural life. Assured of the natural kind heart of the young prince, and warned by a secret presentiment, Murphy thought him for a time perverted by the pernicious influence of Dr. Polidori, whom he instinctively abhorred, and resolved to watch very narrowly. The doctor, for his part, was very much annoyed by Murphy's return, for he feared his frankness, good sense, and keen penetration. He instantly resolved, therefore, cost what it might, to ruin the worthy Englishman in Rodolphe's estimation. It was at this crisis that Seyton and Sarah were presented and received at the court of Gerolstein with such extreme distinction. We have said that Rodolphe, accompanied by Murphy, had been absent from the court on a journey for some weeks. During this absence the doctor was by no means idle. It is said that intriguers discover and recognise each other by certain mysterious signs, which allow of them observing each other until their interests decide them to form a close alliance, or declare unremitting hostility. Some days after the establishment of Sarah and her brother at the court of the Grand Duke, Polidori became a close ally of Seyton's. The doctor confessed to himself, with delectable cynicism, that he felt a natural affinity for rogues and villains, and so he said that, without pretending to discover the end which Sarah and her brother desired to achieve, he was attracted towards them by a sympathy so strong as to lead him to imagine that they plotted some devilish purpose. Some questions of Seyton's as to the disposition and early life of Rodolphe, questions which would have passed without notice with a person less awake to all that occurred than the doctor, in a moment enlightened him as to the ulterior aims of the brother and sister. All he doubted was that the aspirations of the Scotch lady were at the same time honourable as well as ambitious. The arrival of this lovely young woman appeared to Polidori a godsend. Rodolphe's mind was already inflamed with amorous imaginings. Sarah might become, or be made, the delicious reality which should substantiate so many glorious dreams. It was not to be doubted but that she would secure an immense influence over a heart submitted to the witching spell of a first love. The doctor instantly laid his plan to direct and secure this influence, and to make it serve also as the means of destroying Murphy's power and reputation. Like a skilful intriguer, he soon informed the aspiring pair that they must come to an understanding with him, as he alone was responsible to the Grand Duke for the private life of the young prince. Sarah and her brother understood him in a moment, although they had not told the doctor a syllable of their secret designs. On the return of Rodolphe and Murphy, all three, combined by one common intent, tacitly leagued against the squire, their most redoubtable enemy. End of chapter 25, part 1.
Chapter 25, Part 2 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Silva. The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1 by Eugène Sue. Chapter 25, Part 2. What was to happen did happen. Rodolphe saw Sarah daily after his return, and became desperately enamored. She soon told him that she shared his love, although she foresaw that this love would create great trouble. He could never be happy. The distance that separated them was too wide. She then recommended to Rodolphe the most profound discretion, for fear of arousing the Grand Duke's suspicions, as he would be inexorable and deprive them of their only happiness, that of seeing each other every day. The young prince promised to be cautious and conceal his love. The Scotch maiden was too ambitious, too self-possessed to compromise and betray herself in the eyes of the court, and Rodolphe, perceiving the necessity of dissimulation, imitated Sarah's prudence. The lovers' secret was carefully preserved for some time, nor was it until the brother and sister saw the unbridled passion of their dupe reach its utmost excess, and that his infatuation, which he could hardly restrain, threatened to burst forth afresh and destroy all, that they resolved on their final coup. The doctor's character authorizing the confidence, besides the morality which invested it, Satan opened to him on the necessity of a marriage between Rodolphe and Sarah. Otherwise, he added with perfect sincerity, he and his sister would instantly leave Gérolstein. Sarah participated in the prince's affection, but, preferring death to dishonor, she could only be the wife of his highness. This exalted flight of ambition stupefied the doctor, who had never imagined that Sarah's imagination soared so high. A marriage surrounded by numberless difficulties and dangers appeared impossible to Polidori, and he frankly told Satan the reasons why the Grand Duke would never submit to such a union. Satan agreed in the importance of the reasons, but proposed a mezzo termini which should meet all objections, a marriage which, although secret, should be legal, and only avowed after the decease of the Grand Duke. Sarah was of a noble and ancient house, and such a union was not without precedent. Satan gave the prince 8 days to decide. His sister could not longer endure the cruel anguish of uncertainty, and if she must renounce Rodolphe's love, she must act up to her painful resolve as promptly as might be. Certain that he could not mistake Sarah's view, the doctor was sorely perplexed. He had 3 ways before him: to inform the Grand Duke of the matrimonial project, to open Rodolphe's eyes as to the manoeuvres of Tom and Sarah, to lend himself to the marriage. But to inform the Grand Duke would be to alienate from him for ever the heir presumptive of the throne. To enlighten Rodolphe on the interested views of Sarah was to expose himself to the reception which a lover is sure to give when she whom he loves is depreciated in his eyes. And then, what a blow for the vanity or the heart of the young prince to let him know that it was for his royal rank alone that the lady was desirous to wed him. On the other hand, by lending himself to the match, Polidori bound Rodolphe and Sarah to him by a tie of the strongest gratitude, or at least by the complicity of a dangerous act. No doubt all might be discovered, and the doctor exposed to the anger of the Grand Duke. But then the marriage would have been concluded, the union legal. The storm would blow over, and the future sovereign of Gérolstein would become the more bound to Polidori, in proportion as the doctor had undergone greater dangers in his service. After much consideration, therefore, he resolved on serving Sarah, but with a certain qualification, which we will presently refer to. Rodolphe's passion had reached a height almost of frenzy. Violently excited by constraint and the skilful management of Sarah, who pretended to feel still more than he did the insurmountable obstacles which honor and duty placed between them and their liberty, in a few days more the young prince would have betrayed himself. Thus, when the doctor proposed that he must never see his enchantress again, or possess her by a secret marriage, Rodolphe threw himself on Polidori's neck, called him his saviour, his friend, his father. He only wished that the temple and the priest were at hand, that he might marry her that instant, the doctor resolved, for reasons of his own, to undertake the management of all. He found a priest, witnesses, and the union, all the formalities of which were carefully scrutinized and verified by Satan, was secretly celebrated during a temporary absence of the Grand Duke at a conference of the German Diet. The prophecy of the Scotch soothsayer was fulfilled. Sarah wedded the heir to a throne. Without quenching the fire of his love, possession rendered Rodolphe more circumspect, and cooled down the violence which might have compromised the secret of his passion for Sarah. But, directed by Satan and the doctor, the young couple managed so well, and observed so much circumspection towards each other, that they eluded all detection. An event, impatiently desired by Sarah, soon turned his calm into a tempest. She was about to become a mother. It was then that this woman evinced all those exactions which were so new to and so much astonished Rodolphe. She protested, with hypocritical tears streaming from her eyes, that she could no longer support the constraint in which she lived, a constraint rendered the more insupportable by her pregnancy. In this extremity, she boldly proposed to the young prince to tell all to his father, who was, as well as the Dowager Grand Duchess, fonder than ever of her. No doubt, she added, he will be very angry, greatly enraged, and at first, but he loves his son so tenderly, so blindly, and had for her, Sarah, so strong an affection, that his paternal anger would gradually subside, and she would at last take in the court of Gérolstein the rank which was due to her, she might say in a double sense, because she was about to give birth to a child which would be the heir presumptive to the Grand Duke. These pretensions alarmed Rodolphe. He knew the deep attachment which his father had for him, but he also well knew the inflexibility of his principles with regard to all the duties of a prince. To all these objections Sarah replied unmoved, "I am your wife in the presence of God and men. In a short time I shall no longer be able to conceal my situation, and I ought not to blush at that of which I am, on the contrary, so proud, and would desire openly to acknowledge." The expectation of posterity had redoubled Rodolphe's tenderness for Sarah, and placed between the desire to accede to her wishes and the dread of his father's wrath. He experienced the bitterest anguish. Satan sided with his sister. "The marriage is indissoluble," said he to his royal brother-in-law. "The Grand Duke may exile you from his court, you and your wife, nothing more, but he loves you too much to have recourse to such an extremity. He will endure what he cannot prevent." These reasons, strong enough in themselves, did not soothe Rodolphe's anxieties. At this juncture Satan was charged by the Grand Duke with an errand to visit several breeding studs in Austria. This mission, which he could not refuse, would only detain him a fortnight. He set out with much regret, and in a very important moment for his sister. She was chagrined, yet satisfied, at the departure of her brother, for she would lose his advice, but then he would be safe from the Grand Duke's anger if all were discovered. Sarah promised to keep Satan fully informed, day by day, of the progress of events so important to both of them, and that they might correspond more surely and secretly. They agreed upon a cipher, of which Polidori also held the key. This precaution alone proves that Sarah had other matters to tell her brother of besides her love for Rodolphe. In truth, this selfish, cold, ambitious woman had not felt the ice of her heart melt even by the beams of the passionate love which had been breathed to her. Her maternity was only with her a means of acting more effectually on Rodolphe, and had no softening effect on her iron soul. The youth, headlong love, and inexperience of the prince, who was hardly more than a child, and so perfidiously ensnared into an inextricable position, hardly excited an interest in the mind of this selfish creature, and in her confidential communications with him she complained with great disdain and bitterness of the weakness of this young man, who trembled before the most paternal of German princes, who lived however very long. In a word, this correspondence between the brother and sister clearly developed their unbounded selfishness, their ambitious calculations, their impatience, which almost amounted to homicide, and laid bare the springs of that dark conspiracy crowned by the marriage of Rodolphe. One of Sarah's letters to her brother was abstracted by Polidori, the channel of their mutual communications, for what purpose we shall see hereafter. A few days after Seyton's departure, Sarah was at the evening court of the Dowager Grand Duchess. Many of the ladies present looked at her with an astonished air, and whispered to their neighbours. The Grand Duchess Judith, in spite of her 90 years, had a quick ear and a sharp eye, and this little whispering did not escape her. She made a sign to one of the ladies in waiting to come to her, and from her she learned that everybody was remarking that the figure of Miss Sarah Seyton of Halsbury was less slender, less delicate in its proportions than usual. The old princess adored her young protégée, and would have answered to God himself for Sarah's virtue. Indignant at the malevolence of these remarks, she shrugged her shoulders and said aloud, from the end of the saloon in which she was sitting, "My dear Sarah, come here." Sarah rose. It was requisite to cross the circle to reach the place where the princess was seated, who was anxious most kindly to destroy the rumour that was circulated, and by the simple fact of thus crossing the room, confounded her calumniators, and proved triumphantly that the fair proportions of her protégée had lost not one jot of their symmetry and delicacy. Alas, the most perfidious enemy could not have devised a better plan than that suggested by the worthy princess in her desire to defend her protégée. Sarah came towards her, and it required all the deep respect due to the Grand Duchess to repress the murmur of surprise and indignation when the young lady crossed the room. The nearest sighted persons saw what Sarah would no longer conceal, for her pregnancy might have been hidden longer had she but have chosen. But the ambitious woman had sought this display in order to compel Rodolphe to declare his marriage. The Grand Duchess, who however would not be convinced in spite of her eyesight, said in a low voice to Sarah, "My dear child, how very ill you have dressed yourself today. You, whose shape may be spanned by 10 fingers, I hardly know you again." We will relate hereafter the results of this discovery, which led to great and terrible events. At this moment we will content ourselves with stating what the reader has no doubt already guessed, that Fleur de Marie was the fruit of their secret marriage to Rodolphe and Sarah, and that they both believed their daughter dead. It has not been forgotten that Rodolphe, after having visited the house in the Rue du Temple, had returned home, and intended in the evening to be present at a ball given by the ambassadress. It was to this fête that we shall follow His Royal Highness the reigning Grand Duke of Gérolstein, Gustavus Rodolphe, travelling in France under the name of the Count de Duran. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1, by Eugène Sue. Chapter 26. The Ball. As the 11th hour of the night sounded from the different clocks in Paris, the gates of an hotel in the Rue Plumet were thrown open by a Swiss in rich livery, and forthwith issued a magnificent dark blue berlin carriage, drawn by two superb long-tailed grey horses. On the seat, which was covered by a rich hammercloth trimmed with a mossy silk fringe, sat a portly looking coachman, whose head was ornamented by a three-cornered hat, while his rotund figure looked still more imposing in his dress livery coat of blue cloth, trimmed up the seams with silver lace, and thickly braided with the same material, the whole finished by a splendid sable collar and cuffs. Behind the carriage stood a tall, powdered lackey, dressed in a livery of blue, turned up with yellow and silver, and by his side was a chasseur, whose fierce-looking moustaches, gaily embroidered dress and hat, half concealed by a waving plume of blue and yellow feathers, completed a most imposing coup d'oeil. The bright light of the lamps revealed the costly satin lining of the interior of the vehicle we are describing, in which was seated Rodolph, having on his right hand the Baron de Graün, and opposite to him the faithful Murphy. Out of deference for the sovereign represented by the ambassador to whose ball he was then proceeding, Rodolph wore no other mark of distinction than the diamond order of. Round the neck of Sir Walter Murphy, and suspended by a broad orange riband, hung the enamelled cross of the Grand Commander of the Golden Eagle of Gerolstein, and a similar insignia decorated the Baron de Graün amidst an infinite number of the crosses and badges of honour belonging to all countries, depending by a gold chain placed in the two full buttonholes of the diplomatist's coat. "I am delighted," said Rodolph, "with the very favourable accounts I have received from Madame Georges respecting my poor little protégée at the farm of Bouqueval. David's care and attention have worked wonders. Apropos of La Goualeuse, what do you think, Sir Walter Murphy? Any of your Cité acquaintances would say at seeing you so strangely disguised, as at present they would consider you most valiant charcoal man to be, they would be somewhat astonished, I fancy, much in the same degree as the surprise your Royal Highness would excite among your new acquaintances in the Rue du Temple, were you to proceed thither as now attired, to pay a friendly visit to Madame Pipelet, and to inquire after the health of Cabrion's victim, the poor melancholy Alfred. My lord has drawn so lively a sketch of Alfred, attired in his long skirted green coat and bell crowned hat," said the baron, "that I can well imagine him seated in magisterial dignity in his dark and smoky lodge. Let me hope that your Royal Highness's visit to the Rue du Temple has fully answered your expectations, and that you are in every way satisfied with the researches of my agent." "Perfectly so," answered Rodolph. "My success was even beyond my expectations." Then, after a moment's painful silence, and to drive away the train of thought conjured up by the recollection of the probable guilt of Madame d'Harville, he resumed in a tone more gay: "I am almost ashamed to own to so much childishness, but I confess myself amused with the contrast between my treating Madame Pipelet in the morning to a glass of cordial, and then proceeding in the evening to a grand fête, with all the pomp and prestige of one of those privileged beings who, by the grace of God, reign over this lower world. Some men of small fortune would speak of my revenues as those of a millionaire," added Rodolph, in a sort of parenthesis, alluding to the limited extent of his estates. and many millionaires, my lord, might not have the rare, the admirable good sense of the man of narrow means." "Ah, my dear De Graün, you are really too good, much too good. You really overwhelm me," replied Rodolph, with an ironical smile, while the Baron glanced at Murphy with the consciousness of a man who has just discovered he has been saying a foolish thing. "Really, my dear De Graün," resumed Rodolph, "I know not how to acknowledge the weight of your compliment, or how to repay such delicate flattery in its own way." "My lord, let me entreat of you not to take the trouble," exclaimed the Baron, who had for the instant forgotten that Rodolph, who detested every species of flattery, always revenged himself by the most unsparing raillery on those who, directly or indirectly, addressed it to him. "Nay, Baron, I cannot allow myself to remain in your debt. You have praised my understanding. I will, in return, admire your countenance; for, by my honour, as I sit beside you, you look like a youth of 20. Antinous himself could not boast of finer features or a more captivating expression." My lord, I cry your mercy." "Behold him, Murphy, and say whether Apollo could display more graceful limbs, more light and youthful proportions." "I beseech you, my lord, to pardon me from the recollection of how long it is since I have permitted myself to utter the slightest compliment to your royal highness. Observe, Murphy, this band of gold which restrains, without concealing, the locks of rich black hair flowing over this graceful neck, and " My lord, for pity's sake spare me! I repent most sincerely of my involuntary fault," said the unfortunate baron, with an expression of comic despair on his countenance truly ludicrous. It must not be forgotten that the original of this glowing picture was at least 50 years of age, his hair gray, frizzled and powdered, a stiff white cravat round his throat, a pale, withered countenance, and golden spectacles upon the horny bridge of his sharp projecting nose. "Pardon, my lord, pardon, for the baron," exclaimed the squire, laughing. "I beseech you not to overwhelm him beneath the weight of your mythological allusions. I will be answerable to your royal highness that my unlucky friend here will never again venture to utter flattery, since so truth is translated in the new vocabulary of Gérolstein. What, old Murphy, too? Are you going to join in the rebellion against sincerity? My lord, I am so sorry for the position of my unfortunate vis-à-vis that I beg I may divide his punishment with him. Charcoal man in ordinary, your disinterested friendship does you honour. But seriously now, my dear De Graün, how have you forgotten that I only allow such fellows as D'Harneim and his train to flatter, for the simple reason that they know not how to speak the truth? That cuckoo note of false praise belongs to birds of such feather as themselves, and the species they claim relationship with. But for a person of your mind and good taste to descend to its usage, oh, fie, baron, fie!" "It is all very well, my lord," said the baron, sturdily; "but I must be allowed to say, with all due apology for my boldness, that there is no small portion of pride in your royal highness's aversion to receive even a just compliment." "Well said, baron. Come, I like you better now you speak plain truths. But tell me how you prove your assertion." "Why, just so, my lord, because you repudiate it upon the same principle that might induce a beautiful woman, well aware of her charms, to say to one of her most enthusiastic admirers, 'I know perfectly well how handsome I am, and therefore your approval is perfectly uncalled for and unnecessary.' What is the use of reiterating what everybody knows? Is it usual to proclaim in the open streets that the sun shines, when all may see and feel certain of his midday brightness? Now, baron, you are shifting your ground and becoming more dangerous as you become more adroit, and, by way of varying your punishment, I will only say that the infernal Polidori himself could not have more ingeniously disguised the poisonous draught of flattery when seeking to persuade some poor victim to swallow it. My lord, I am now effectually silenced." "Then," said Murphy, and this time with an air of real seriousness, "your Royal Highness has now no doubt as to its being really Polidori you encountered in the Rue du Temple." "I have ceased to have the least doubt on the subject, since I learned through you that he had been in Paris for some time past." "I had forgotten, or rather purposely omitted to mention to your lordship," said Murphy in a sorrowing tone, "a name that never failed to awaken painful feelings; and knowing as I do how justly odious the remembrance of this man was to your Royal Highness, I studiously abstained from all reference to it." The features of Rodolph were again overshadowed with gloom, and plunged into a deep reverie. He continued to preserve unbroken the silence which prevailed until the carriage stopped in the courtyard of the Embassy. The windows of the hotel were blazing with 1,000 lights, which shone brightly through the thick darkness of the night, while a crowd of lackeys, in full dress liveries, lined the entrance hall, extending even to the salons of reception, where the grooms of the chamber waited to announce the different arrivals. M. le Comte, the Ambassador, with his lady, had purposely remained in the first reception room until the arrival of Rodolph, who now entered, followed by Murphy and M. de Graün. Rodolph was then in his 36th year, in the very prime and perfection of manly health and strength. His regular and handsome features, with the air of dignity pervading his whole appearance, would have rendered him, under any circumstances, a strikingly attractive man; but, combined with the éclat of high birth and exalted rank, he was a person of first rate importance in every circle in which he presented himself, and whose notice was assiduously sought for. Dressed with the utmost simplicity, Rodolph wore a white waistcoat and cravat, a blue coat, buttoned up closely, on the right breast of which sparkled a diamond star, displayed to admiration the light yet perfect proportions of his graceful figure, while his well fitting pantaloons, of black kerseymere, defined the finely formed leg and handsome foot in its embroidered stocking. From the rareness of the Grand Duke's visits to the Haute Monde, his arrival produced a great sensation, and every eye was fixed upon him from the moment that, attended by Murphy and Baron de Graün, he entered the first salon at the Embassy. An attaché, deputed to watch for his arrival, hastened immediately to apprise the ambassadress of the appearance of her illustrious guest. Her Excellency instantly hurried with her noble husband to welcome their visitor, exclaiming: "Your Royal Highness is indeed kind, thus to honour our poor entertainment." "Nay, madame," replied Rodolph, gracefully bowing on the hand extended to him, "your ladyship is well aware of the sincere pleasure it affords to pay my compliments to yourself; and as for M. le Comte, he and I are two old friends who are always delighted to meet. Are we not, my lord?" "Your Royal Highness, in deigning to continue to me so flattering a place in your recollection, makes it still more impossible for me ever to forget your many acts of condescending kindness." "I assure you, M. le Comte, that in my memory the past never dies, or at least the pleasant part of it, for I make it a strict rule never to preserve any reminiscences of my friends but such as are agreeable and gratifying." "Your Royal Highness has found the secret of being happy in your thoughts, and rendering others so at the same time," rejoined the Ambassador, smiling with gratified pride and pleasure at a conference so cordially carried on before a gathering crowd of admiring auditors. "Thus, then, madame," replied Rodolph, "will your flattering reception of to night live long in my memory, and I shall promise myself the happiness of recalling this evening's fête with its tasteful arrangements and crowd of attending beauties. Ah, Madame la Comtesse, who like you can effect such a union of taste and elegance as now sparkles around us?" "Your Royal Highness is too indulgent." "But I have a very important question to ask you. Why is it that, lovely as are your fair guests, their charms are never seen to such perfection as when assembled beneath your hospitable roof?" "Your Royal Highness is pleased to view our fair visitants through the same flattering medium with which you are graciously pleased to behold our poor endeavours for your and their amusement," answered the Ambassador, with a deferential bow. "Your pardon, Count," replied Rodolph, "if I differ with you in opinion. According to my judgment, the cause proceeds wholly from our amiable hostess, Madame l'Ambassadrice." "May I request of your Royal Highness to solve this enigma?" inquired the Countess, smiling. "That is easily given, madame, and may be found in the perfect urbanity and exquisite grace with which you receive your lovely guests, and whisper to each a few charming and encouraging words, which, if the least bit exceeding strict truth," said Rodolph, smiling with good tempered satire, "renders those who are even praised above their merits more radiant in beauty from your kind commendations, while those whose charms admit of no exaggeration are no less radiant with the happiness of finding themselves so justly appreciated by you. Thus each countenance, thanks to the gentle arts you practise, is made to exhibit the most smiling delight, for perfect content will set off even homely features. And thus I account for why it is that woman, all lovely as she is, never looks so much so as when seen beneath your roof. Come, M. l'Ambassadeur, own that I have made out a good case, and that you entirely concur with me in opinion." "Your Royal Highness has afforded me too many previous reasons to admire and adopt your opinions for me to hesitate in the present instance." "And for me, my lord," said the countess, "at the risk of being included among those fair ladies who get a little more praise or flattery (which was it your highness styled it?) than they deserve, I accept your very flattering explanation with as much qualified pleasure as if it were really founded on truth. In order more effectually to convince you, madame, that nothing is more correct than all I have asserted, let us make a few observations touching the fine effect of praise in animating and lighting up the countenance." "Ah, my lord, you are laying a very mischievous snare for me," said the countess, smiling. "Well, then, I will abandon that idea, but upon one condition, that you honour me by taking my arm. I have been told wonderful things of a winter garden, a work from fairyland. May I put up my humble petition to be allowed to see this new wonder of 101 Nights?" "Oh, my lord, with the utmost pleasure; but I see that your highness had received a most exaggerated account. Perhaps you will accompany me and judge for yourself. Only, in this instance, I would fain hope that your habitual indulgence may induce you to feel as little disappointment as possible at finding how imperfectly the reality equals your expectations." The ambassadress then took the offered arm of Rodolph, and proceeded with him to the other salons, while the count remained conversing with the Baron de Graün and Murphy, whom he had been acquainted with for some time. And a more beautiful scene of enchantment never charmed the eye than that presented by the aspect of the winter garden to which Rodolph had conducted his noble hostess. Let the reader imagine an enclosure of about 40 feet in length and 30 in width, leading out of a long and splendid gallery, surmounted by a glazed and vaulted roof, the building being securely covered in for about 50 feet. Round the parallelogram it described, the walls were concealed by an infinite number of mirrors, over which was placed a small and delicate trellis of fine green rushes, which, thanks to the strong light reflected on the highly polished glass, resembled an arbour, and were almost entirely hidden by a thick row of orange trees, as large as those of the Tuileries, mixed with camellias of equal size, while the golden fruit and verdant foliage of the one contrasted beautifully with the rich clusters of waxen flowers of all colours with which the other was loaded. The remainder of the garden was thus devised: 5 or 6 enormous clumps of trees and Indian or other tropical shrubs, planted in immense cases filled with peat earth, were surrounded by allées paved with a mosaic shell work, and sufficiently wide for 2 or 3 persons to walk abreast. It is impossible to describe the wondrous effect produced by this rich display of tropical vegetation in the midst of a European winter, and almost in the very centre of a ballroom. Here might be seen gigantic bananas stretching their tall arms to the glass roof which covered them, and blending the vivid green of their palms with the lanceolated leaves of the large magnolias, some of which already displayed their matchless and odoriferous flowers with their bell-shaped calices, purple without and silvery white within, from which started forth the little gold-threaded stamens. At a little distance were grouped the palm and date trees of the Levant, the red macaw, and fig trees from India, all blooming in full health and vigour, and displaying their foliage in all its luxuriance, gave to the tout ensemble a mass of rich, brilliant tropical verdure which, glittering among the thousand lights, sparkled with the colours of the emerald. Along the trellising between the orange trees and amid the clumps were trained every variety of rare climbing plants, sometimes hanging their long wreaths of leaves and flowers in graceful festoons, then depending like blooming serpents from the tall boughs, now trailing at their roots, then ambitiously scaling the very walls, till they hung their united tresses round the transparent and vaulted roof, from which again they floated in mingled masses, waving in the pure light breeze loaded with so many odours. The winged pomegranate, the passion flower with its large purple flowers striated with azure and crowned with its dark violet tuft, waved in long spiral wreaths over the heads of the admiring crowd, then, as though fatigued with the sport, threw their colossal garlands of delicate flowers across the hard prickly leaves of the gigantic aloes. The bignonia of India, with its long cup shaped flower of dark sulphur colour and slight slender leaves, was placed beside the delicate flesh coloured petals of the stephanotis, so justly appreciated for its exquisite perfume, the 2 stems mutually clinging to each other for support, and mingling their leaves and flowers in one confused mass, disposed them in elegant festoons of green fringe, spangled with gold and silver spots, around the immense velvet foliage of the Indian fig. Further on, started forth and then fell again in a sort of variegated and floral cascade, immense quantities of the stalks of the Asclepias, whose leaves, large, umbulated, and in clusters of from 15 to 20 star shaped flowers, grew so thickly, so evenly, that they might have been mistaken for bouquets of pink enamel surrounded with leaves of fine green porcelain. The borders of the cases containing the orange sand camellias were filled with the choicest Cape heaths, the tulips of Thal, the narcissus of Constantinople, the hyacinth, irides, and cyclamina of Persia, forming a sort of natural carpet, presenting one harmonious blending of the loveliest tints. Chinese lanterns of transparent silk, some pale blue, others pink, partly concealed amidst the foliage, threw a soft and gentle light over this enchanting scene, nor could a more ingenious idea have been resorted to than in the happy amalgamation of these two colours, by which a charming and almost unearthly light was produced, combining the clear cerulean blue of a summer's night with the rose-coloured coruscations emitted from sparkling rays of an aurora borealis. The entrance to this immense hothouse was from a long gallery, glittering with gold, with mirrors, crystal vases filled with the choicest perfumes, and brilliantly lighted, and also raised a few steps above the fairy palace we have been endeavouring to describe. The dazzling brightness of the approach served as a sort of penumbra, in which were indistinctly traced out the gigantic exotics discernible through a species of arch, partly concealed by two crimson velvet curtains looped back with golden cords, so as to give a dim and misty view of the enchanted land that lay beyond. An imaginative mind might easily have persuaded himself he stood near a huge window opening on some beautiful Asiatic landscape during the tranquillity of a summer's twilight. The sounds of the orchestra, weakened by distance and broken by the joyous hum proceeding from the gallery, died languidly away among the motionless foliage of the huge trees. Insensibly each fresh visitant to this enchanting spot lowered his voice until his words fell in whispers, for the light genuine air, embalmed with 1,000 rich odours, appeared to cast a sort of somnolency over the senses. Every breath seemed to speak of the clustering plants, whose balmy sweetness filled the atmosphere. Certainly 2 lovers, seated in some corner of this Eden, could conceive no greater happiness to be enjoyed on earth than thus dreamily to rest beneath the trees and flowers of this terrestrial paradise. At the end of this winter garden were placed immense divans beneath canopies of leaves and flowers, the subdued light of the hothouse forming a powerful contrast with the gallery. The distance seemed filled with a species of gold-coloured shining fog, in the midst of which glittered and flickered, like a living embroidery, the dazzling and varied robes of the ladies, combined with the prismatic scintillations of the congregated mass of diamonds and precious stones. Rodolph's first sensation upon arriving at this enchanting triumph of art over nature was that of most unfeigned surprise. "This is indeed a wonderfully beautiful carrying out of a poetical idea," said he, almost involuntarily. Then, turning to the ambassadress, he exclaimed, "Madame, till now I had not deemed such wonders practicable. We have not in the scene before us a mere union of unbounded expense with the most exquisite taste, but you give us poetry in action. Instead of writing as a master poet, or painting as a first-rate artist, you create that which they would scarcely venture to dream of." "Your Royal Highness is too indulgent." "Nay, but candidly all must agree that the mind which could so faithfully depict this ravishing scene, with its charm of colours and contrasts beyond us, the loud notes of joy and mirthful reverie, here the soft silence and sweet gentle murmurs of distant voices, that lull the spirit into a fancied flight beyond this fitful existence. Surely, without suspicion of flattery, it may be said of the planner and contriver of all this, such a one was born a poet and a painter combined." "The praises of your Royal Highness are so much the more dangerous from the skill and cleverness with which they are uttered, and which makes us listen to them with delight, even in defiance of our sternest resolutions. But allow me to call your Royal Highness's attention to the very lovely person who is approaching us. I must have you admit that the Marquise d'Harville must shine preeminently beautiful any and everywhere. Is she not graceful, and does not the gentle elegance of her whole appearance acquire a fresh charm from the contrast with the severe yet classic beauty by whom she is accompanied?" The individuals thus alluded to were the Countess Sarah Macgregor and the Marquise d'Harville, who were at this moment descending the steps which led from the gallery to the Winter Garden. Neither was the panegyric bestowed by the ambassadress on Madame d'Harville at all exaggerated. No words can accurately describe the loveliness of her person, and the Marquise d'Harville was then in the first bloom of youthful charms; but her beauty, delicate and fragile as it was, appeared less to belong to the strict regularity of her features than to the irresistible expression of sweetness and universal kindness, which imparted a charm to her countenance impossible to resist or to describe; and this peculiar charm served invariably to distinguish Madame d'Harville from all other fashionable beauties, for goodness of heart and kindliness of disposition are but rarely seen as the prevailing passions revealed in a face as fair, as young, high born, and ardently worshipped by all, as was the Marquise d'Harville, who shone forth in all her lustre as the brightest star in the galaxy of fashion. Too wise, virtuous, and right minded to listen to the host of flatterers by whom she was surrounded, Madame d'Harville smiled as gratefully on all as though she could have given them credit for speaking the truth, had not her own modest opinion of her just claims to such homage have forbidden her accepting a praise she never could have deserved. Wholly indifferent to flattery, yet sensibly alive to kindness, she perfectly distinguished between sympathy and insincerity. Her acute penetration, correct judgment, and lively wit, unmixed by the slightest ill nature, made her wage an early though good-tempered war with those vain and egotistical beings who crowd and oppress society with the view of monopolizing general attention, and, blinded by their own self-love, expect one universal deference and submission. "Those kind of persons," said Madame d'Harville one day, laughingly, "appear to me as if their whole lives were passed in dancing le cavalier seul before an invisible mirror." An unassuming and unpretending person, however reserved and consequently unpopular he might be with others, was sure to find a steady friend and partial observer in Madame d'Harville. This trifling digression is absolutely essential to the right understanding of facts of which we shall speak hereafter. The complexion of Madame d'Harville was of the purest white, tinged with the most delicate carnation. Her long tresses of bright chestnut hair floated over her beautifully formed shoulders, white and polished as marble. It would be an impossible task to describe her large, dark grey eyes, fringed with their thick lashes and beaming with angelic sweetness. Her coral lips, with their gentle smile, gave to her eyes the indefinable charm that her affable and winning mode of expressing herself derived from their mild and angelic expression of approving goodness. We will not further delay the reader by describing the perfection of her figure, nor dwell upon the distinguished air which marked her whole appearance. She wore a white crape dress, trimmed with the natural flowers of the camellia, intermixed with its own rich green leaves. Here and there a diamond sparkled among the waxy petals, as if a dewdrop fresh from its native skies had fallen there. A garland of the same flowers, equally ornamented with precious stones, was placed with infinite grace upon her fair and open brow. The peculiar style of the Countess Sarah Macgregor's beauty served to set off the fair feminine loveliness of her companion. Though turned 35 years of age, Sarah looked much younger. Nothing appears to preserve the body more effectually from all the attacks of sickness or decay than a cold-hearted, egotistical disregard of everyone but ourselves. It encrusts the body with a cold, icy covering, which alike resists the inroads of bodily or mental wear and tear. To this cause may be ascribed the wonderful preservation of Countess Sarah's appearance. The lady whose name we last mentioned wore a dress of pale amber watered silk. Beneath a crape tunic of the same colour, a simple wreath of the dark leaves of the Pyrus japonicus encircled her head and harmonized admirably with the bandeau of raven hair it confined. This classically severe mode of headdress gave to the profile of this imperious woman the character and resemblance of an antique statue. Many persons, mistaking their real cast of countenance, imagine some peculiar vocation delineated in their traits. Thus one man who fancies he possesses a warlike air assumes the warrior; another imagines his eye in a fine frenzy rolling, marks him out as a poet. Instantly he turns down his shirt collar, adopts poetical language, and writes himself poet. So the self-imagined conspirator wastes days and hours in pondering over mighty deeds he feels called upon to do. The politician, upon the same terms, bores the world and his friends with his perpetual outpourings upon political economy; and the man whose saintly turn of countenance persuades its owner into the belief of a corresponding character within, forthwith abjures the pomps and vanities of the world, and aims at reforming his brethren by his pulpit eloquence. Now, ambition being Sarah's ruling passion, and her noble and aristocratical features well assisting the delusion, she smiled as the word diadem crossed her thoughts, and lent a willing ear to the predictions of her Highland nurse, and firmly believed herself predestined to a sovereign destiny, spite of the trifling embonpoint that gave to her figure, which, though fatter than Madame de Harville's, was not less slender and nymph-like, a voluptuous gracefulness. Sarah boasted of all the freshness of early youth, and few could long sustain the fire of her black and piercing eyes. Her nose was aquiline. Her finely formed mouth and rich ruby lips were expressive of the highest determination, haughtiness, and pride. The Marquis and Sarah had recognized Rodolph in the Winter Garden at the moment they were descending into it from the gallery, but the Prince feigned not to observe their presence. "The Prince is so absorbed with the Ambassadress," said Madame de Harville to Sarah, "that he pays not the slightest attention to us." "You are quite mistaken, my dear Clémence," rejoined the Countess. "The Prince saw us as quickly and as plainly as we saw him, but I frightened him away. You see he still bears malice with me. I am more than ever at a loss to understand the singular obstinacy with which he persists in shunning you. You, formerly an old friend." "Countess Sarah and myself are sworn enemies," replied he to me once in a joking manner. "I have made a vow never to speak to her, and you may judge how sacred must be the vow that hinders me from conversing with so charming a lady." And, strange and unaccountable as was this reply, I had no alternative but to submit to it. "And yet I can assure you that the cause of this deadly feud, half in jest and half in earnest as it is, originates in the most simple circumstances. Were it not that a third party is implicated in it, I should have explained the whole to you long ago. But what is the matter, my dear child? You seem as though your thoughts were far from the present scene." "Nothing, nothing, I assure you," replied the marquise, faintly; "but the gallery is so very hot, it gave me a violent headache. Let us sit down here for a minute or two, and I hope and believe it will soon be better." You are right. See, here is a nice quiet corner, where you will be in perfect safety from the researches of those who are lamenting your absence," added Sarah, pronouncing the last words with marked emphasis. The two ladies then seated themselves on a divan, almost concealed beneath the clustering shrubs and overhanging plants. "I said those who would be lamenting your absence, my dear Clémence. Come, own that I deserve praise for so discreetly forming my speech." The Marquise blushed slightly, cast down her eyes, but spoke not. "How unreasonable you are!" exclaimed Sarah, in a tone of friendly reproach. "Can you not trust me, my dear child?" "Yes, child, for am I not old enough to be your mother?" "Not trust you!" uttered the Marquise sadly. "Alas! Have I not, on the contrary, confessed that to you which I should hardly have dared to own to myself?" "Well, then, come, rouse yourself now. Let us have a little talk about him. And so, have you really sworn to drive him to despair?" "For the love of Heaven!" exclaimed Madame d'Harville, "think what you are saying." "I tell you I know him better than you do, my poor child. He is a man of cool and decided energy, who sets but little value on his life. He has had misfortunes enough to make him quite weary of it, and it really seems as if you daily found greater pleasure in tormenting him and playing with his feelings." "Is it possible you can really think so?" "Indeed, in spite of myself, I cannot refrain from entertaining that opinion. Oh, if you but knew how over susceptible some minds are rendered by a continuance of sorrows and afflictions! Just now I saw 2 large tears fall from his eyes as he gazed on you." "Are you quite sure of what you say?" "Indeed, I am quite certain, and that, too, in a ballroom, at the risk of becoming an object of general derision. If this uncontrollable misery were perceived let me tell you, a person must truly love to bear all this, and even to be careless about concealing his sufferings from the world." "For the love of Heaven, do not speak thus!" replied Madame d'Harville, in a voice trembling with emotion. "Alas, you have touched me nearly! I know too well what it is to struggle with a hidden grief, yet wear an outward expression of calmness and resignation. Alas, alas! 'Tis the deep pity and commiseration I feel for him has been my ruin," added she, almost unconsciously. "Nonsense! What an over nice person you are, to talk of a little innocent flirtation being ruinous, and that, too, with a man so scrupulously guarded as to abstain from ever appearing in your husband's presence, for fear of compromising you. You must admit that M. Charles Robert is a man of surprising honour, delicacy, and real feeling. I feel the more inclined to espouse his cause from the recollection that you have never met him elsewhere but at my house, and because I can answer for his principles, and that his devoted attachment to you can only be equalled by the deep respect he bears you. I have never doubted the many noble qualities you have so repeatedly assured me he possesses, but you know well that it is his long succession of bitter afflictions which have so warmly interested me in his favour. And well does he merit this interest, and most fully do his excellent qualities absolve you of all blame in thus bestowing it. Surely so fine and noble a countenance bespeaks a mind equally superior to all mankind. How completely are you reminded, while gazing on his tall and finely proportioned figure, of the preux chevaliers of bygone days, sans peur and sans reproche. I once saw him dressed in his uniform as commandant of the National Guard, and, handsome as he is, I really think he looks surpassingly well, and I could but say to myself that if nobility were the award of inward merit and external beauty, M. Charles Robert, instead of being so called, would take precedence of nearly all our dukes and peers. Would he not be a fitting representative of any of the most distinguished families in France? You know, my dear countess, how very little importance I attach to mere birth, and you yourself have frequently reproached me with being strongly inclined to republicanism," said Madame d'Harville, smiling gently. "For my own part, I always thought with you that M. Charles Robert required not the aid of rank or titles to render him worthy of universal admiration. Then, what extreme talent he possesses! What a fine voice he has! And what delightful morning concerts we three have been able to achieve, owing to his all powerful assistance! Ah, my dear Clémence, do you remember the first time you ever sang with him? What passionate expression did he not throw into the words of that beautiful duet, so descriptive of his love, and his fear of offending her who was the object of it by revealing it?" "Let me entreat of you," said Madame d'Harville, after a long silence, "to speak of something else. Indeed, I dare not listen further. What you but just now intimated of his depressed and unhappy appearance has caused me much pain." "Nay, my dear friend, I meant not to grieve you, but merely to point out the probability that a man rendered doubly sensitive by the succession of past misfortunes might feel his courage insufficient to encounter the fresh trial of your rejection of his suit, and thus be induced to end his hopeless love and his life together." "Oh, no more, no more!" almost shrieked Madame d'Harville, interrupting Sarah. "This fearful idea has glanced across my mind already." Then, after a second silence of some minutes, the marquise resumed: "Let us, as I said before, talk of somebody else, of your mortal enemy, for instance," added she, with assumed gaiety of manner. "Come, we will take the prince for a fresh theme of conversation. I had not seen him previously to this evening for a very long time. Do you know that I think he looks handsomer than ever? Though all but king, he has lost none of the winning sweetness and affability of his manner. In spite of my republicanism, I must confess I have seldom, if ever, known so irresistible a person." Sarah threw a side glance of deep and scrutinising hatred upon her unconscious rival; but, quickly recovering herself, she said gaily: "Now, my dear Clémence, you must confess to being a most capricious little lady. You have regular alternating paroxysms of admiration and violent dislike for the prince. Why, a few months ago, I mean about his first arrival here, you were so captivated by him that, between ourselves, I was half afraid you had lost your heart past all hope of recall." "Thanks to you," replied Madame d'Harville, smiling, "my admiration was very short lived, for so well did you act up to your character of the prince's sworn foe, and such fearful tales did you tell me of his profligacy and misconduct, that you succeeded in inspiring me with an aversion as powerful as had been the infatuation which led you to fear for the safety of my heart, which, by the way, I cannot think would ever have been placed in any danger from the attempts of your enemy to disturb its repose, since, shortly before you gave me those frightful particulars of the prince's character, he had quite ceased to honour me with his visits, although on the most intimate and friendly terms with my husband." "Talking of your husband, pray is he here to night?" inquired Sarah. "No," replied Madame d'Harville, in a tone of embarrassment; "he preferred remaining at home. He seems to me to mix less and less in the world. He never liked what is called fashionable gaiety." The marquise's agitation visibly increased, and Sarah, whose quick eye easily perceived it, continued: "The last time I saw him he looked even paler than usual. He has been very much out of health lately. My dearest Clémence, will you permit me to speak to you without reserve? Oh, yes, pray do. How comes it that the least allusion to your husband always throws you into such a state of extraordinary alarm and uneasiness? What an idea! Is it possible you can mean it seriously?" asked poor Madame d'Harville, trying to smile. "Indeed, I am quite in earnest," rejoined her companion. "Whenever you are speaking of him, your countenance assumes, even in spite of yourself, but how shall I make myself understood? and Sarah, with the tone and fixed gaze of one who wished to read the most secret thoughts of the person she addressed, slowly and emphatically added, a look of mingled aversion and fear. The fixed, pallid features of Madame d'Harville at first defied even Sarah's practised eye, but her keen gaze soon detected a slight convulsive working of the mouth, with a tremulous movement of the under lip of her victim. But feeling it unsafe to pursue the subject farther at this moment, so as to awaken the marquise's mistrust of her friendly intentions, by way, therefore, of concealing her real suspicions, she continued: "Yes, just that sort of dislike any woman would entertain for a peevish, jealous, ill-tempered." At this explanation of the countess's meaning as regarded Madame d'Harville's imagined dislike for her husband, a heavy load seemed taken from her. The working of her lips ceased, and she replied: "Let me assure you, M. d'Harville is neither peevish nor jealous." Then, as if searching for some means of breaking a conversation so painful to her feelings, she suddenly exclaimed: "Ah, here comes that tiresome friend of my husband's, the Duc de Lucenay. I hope he has not seen us. Where can he have sprung from? I thought he was 1,000 miles off." It was reported that he had gone somewhere in the East for a year or two, and behold, at the end of 5 months, here he is back again. His unexpected arrival must have sadly annoyed the Duchess de Lucenay, though poor de Lucenay is a very inoffensive creature," said Sarah, with an ill natured smile. "Nor will Madame de Lucenay be the only one to feel vexation at his thus changing his mind. Her friend, M. de Saint Remy, will duly and affectionately sympathise in all her regrets on the subject." "Come, come, my dear Sarah, I cannot allow you to scandalise. Say that this return of M. de Lucenay is a nuisance to everybody. The duke is sufficiently disagreeable for you to generalise the regret his unexpected presence occasions." "I do not slander, I merely repeat. It is also said that M. de Saint Remy, the model of our young élégantes, whose splendid doings have filled all Paris, is all but ruined. 'Tis true, he has by no means reduced either his establishment or his expenditure. However, there are several ways of accounting for that. In the first place, Madame de Lucenay is immensely rich. What a horrible idea! Still, I only repeat what others say. There, the duke sees us. He is coming towards us. We must resign ourselves to our fate. Miserable, is it not? I know nothing so hard to bear as that man's company. He makes himself so very disagreeable, and then laughs so disgustingly loud at the silly things he says. Indeed, he is so boisterous that the bare idea of him makes one think of pretending to faint, or any other pretext to avoid him. Talking of fainting, pray let me beg of you, if you have the least regard for your fan or essence bottle, to beware how you allow him to handle either, for he has the unfortunate habit of breaking whatever he touches, and all with the most facetious, self-satisfied air imaginable. End of Chapter 26. Recording by James O'Connor, Randolph, Massachusetts, May, 2012. End of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 1, by Eugène Sue.